Breakthrough news. This is another, I don't know if you want to call it special. I think maybe we should call it emergency live stream, Rania, as there is a massive ongoing assault happening in Gaza right now. The Israelis continuing to pound the Gaza Strip. At least 140 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip. 39 children. 950, at least 950 have been wounded. In the West Bank, Israeli forces have killed at least 13 Palestinians. So there is a ongoing massive assault. A number of people are continuing to be killed in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, inside 48 Palestine. And so the crisis that has erupted in Palestine continues and rolls on. I'm Eugene ElAri here for Breakthrough News alongside Rania Khalek. Rania, happy to be back with you, even in tough circumstances.
Yeah, Eugene, I'm happy to be back with you, and I'm really thankful that we have this program, Breakthrough News, in order to be able to do this at times like these. The intensity of the attacks on Gaza have grown so extreme in the last couple of days. Friends of mine from Gaza, and I think you've been hearing the same thing, are saying that this level of airstrikes is actually more intense than what they experienced in 2014. And 2014 was Operation Protective Edge, and just a reminder that Israeli campaign ended up killing over 2,200 Palestinians, over 500 of whom were children, in the course of 51 days. And, so far the casualty count is rising this time around, and we're hearing it's even worse. And some of the images that you're seeing on the screen are from what happened earlier today. Quite shocking. It looks as if the Israelis intentionally targeted a building that houses various media and outlets, including the Associated Press, Al Jazeera. This isn't the first time they've done this. They did this several times back in 2016 or 2014. But just watching that building come down, I mean, that video has gone viral because it's just so shocking and so intentional. And people really need to understand what we're witnessing right now is not a war between Israel and Gaza. We're witnessing an Israeli assault on civilians in Gaza. This is an assault, an intentional assault on families and children. Families and children. Before this media building was taken down today, the big news out of Gaza was that the Israelis had killed 10 members from a single family, 8 of whom were women, or 8 of whom were children, and 2 of whom were women. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there was an infant who survived that bombing. Yes. 8 children from the same family taken out in an Israeli airstrike. And then you look at these Western officials and they're saying, oh, Israel's defending itself. They have a right to defend themselves. Anyone who watches what's taking place in Gaza and calls this self-defense is either on drugs or is lying to you.
Yes, I think that's very true. And also
and I'm sorry, I want to apologize to drug users
tomorrow
because that was actually...
No, I understand. I appreciate that clarification. It's a lot going on. So I understand the shorthand there for sure. The UN Security Council will be meeting tomorrow. It's interesting, the Irish foreign minister announced today that Ireland will be, in his words, speaking out strongly around the killing of children by the IDF in their attacks on the Gaza Strip. So that certainly will be another flashpoint in the international community tomorrow. But as we continue here today, also worth noting, Rania, the head of the Associated Press noted that there will be less known about what happens in Gaza because of what took place with the taking down of this media building. So he didn't come out right and say it, but really alluding to the fact that because they were told to evacuate ahead of time, Al Jazeera, the Associated Press, and other media, it was clear that they were being targeted specifically to hurt the infrastructure of the images that have been coming out from Gaza over the past few days in relationship to this air and this artillery assault that has obviously been so brutal. Of course, at least 140 killed, at least 950 wounded. 39 of those killed in the Gaza Strip are children. That's confirmed. And of course, that's at least, and we will continue to bring you updates, but we want to bring our first guest just right here, especially it's very late there. Ref ElAri, who is an author of Gaza Writes Back, is joining us here on Breakthrough News live from Gaza. Rifat, thank you so much for being here with us.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes, sir.
Pleasure to be with you.
Tell us right now, if you could. Please go ahead, Rania.
I was just saying thank you, Rifat, for joining us. I know that we've been having some trouble with connection issues. Tell us what it's like right now on the ground for you in Gaza.
Like
it appears we maybe have.
it's already
there he is.
It's already more devastating than what happened in 2014. But I want just to get a bit to about Palestine. And what's in Gaza is very much connected to what's going on in occupied Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah, the invasion of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Holy Mosque in the month of Ramadan, the split of Palestinians who lived there for generations. This is very much connected with what's going on in occupied Jaffa and Akka, Jewish gangs supported by Israeli officials are just to lynch, commit pogroms against native Palestinians and burn, torch their houses like we saw yesterday. So Israel has already killed over 100 Palestinians in Gaza, most of whom are civilian, most of whom are children, like you just mentioned, Eugene. We're talking about 40 kids. Some of them are months old, and usually the kids were killed with their parents. Yesterday, there was a hideous crime in Gaza's probably most crowded camp that killed 10 Palestinians. The only was Omar. He is a 2-month old baby. But other than the human devastation that's taking place, that probably that's something that goes underreported or unreported, is the fact that Israel is literally sending Gaza 100 years back. Israel is destroying the infrastructure. The roads are gone. The roads to hospitals are gone. I want in 2014, Israel destroyed most of Shijaiya, where I live. I was in Malaysia then, and it killed my brother and destroyed my flat, my apartment with my family home. So many people, like 20 people from just of them, were my relatives. 3 days ago, my father was stuck in Shijaiya, didn't evacuate, and Israel started so you're following this, how Israel fed the false news to the international media about the invasion in order to commit more massacres again. It was a night from hell. I describe this as the 10th circle of hell that I didn't speak about in the divine. My father was stuck, and he managed miraculously many people to get out the next day. And I can't reach them because of the bombing, but also because the roads are destroyed, the electricity cut off most of the time, no water in many areas, no sewage, no internet access in places.
So I want to remind people that we're speaking to Ref ElAri. He is the author of Gaza Writes Back, and he's joining us by phone from Gaza. And he was just describing that, Israel you said, Rifat, that Israel setting Gaza back 100 years, talking about the intentional targeting of infrastructure, which is probably one of the reasons, why the connection isn't as great as it could be. And that's intentional here. It's, I think, to make it more difficult to talk to people in Gaza who are experiencing this devastating campaign of what looks like just sheer terror. Rifat, you have children, right?
Yeah.
How many children do you have? 6. And what are the ages?
I have Shaima. She's in her final high school. She's having tough. She touched the book in a week. And I have she's 17, and Amal is 6 years old. Her birthday was the day I mentioned in my article times.
And how are they dealing with this? I mean, it can't be easy. This isn't the first war you've gone through having children, but it can't be easy for them to hear these kinds of airstrikes.
Yeah, exactly. All my kids were born and in war before or after. This is how we sometimes talk about one of the kids was born before this 2008 or 2012 or 2014. It's horrible on the kids, horrible on the sick people, it's horrible on the people with disability, and it's horrible on people suffering from 19. Gaza is plagued with COVID-19 cases, and Israel, one of my kids was joking that Israel eradicated COVID from Gaza because now the clinics were targeted. There were reports and pictures of COVID-19 clinics providing services to sick people were destroyed by Israel. There is no way you can socially distance when you have to huddle in a safe corner in the house, so you can avoid the stray Israeli missiles. So it's horrible on the kids, trauma-wise, like psychologically. I said that if we survive horrible Israeli settler colonial war on Palestinians, I'm not sure we're going to survive this psychologically. The kids are traumatized beyond imagine.
And once again, just to remind our viewers that we are talking to Ref ElAri. He is the author of Gaza Writes Back. He's in Gaza right now, speaking to us by phone. Eugene, I'm sure that you have something you'd like to ask Rifat.
Yeah, Rifat, and thank you again for joining us from Gaza. I mean, it seems to me that the situation that people are facing there is not only so dire currently, but this is a continuation of, what really has become an open-air prison. I mean, how does this moment fit into what people have been enduring for the past several months? I mean, obviously it's more intense, I'm sure, but it seems like it's almost like an ongoing, to those of us on the outside looking in, almost an ongoing nightmare.
Sadly, international media, even when it biased against Palestine, pay attention when Palestinians are dying in tens, in hundreds. And usually the New York Times was just moments or a period of quiet that preceded this. A period of quiet from 2014 to 2014, more than 500 Palestinians from Gaza by snipers, by bombs. So Gaza has never been quiet ever since it came under Israeli occupation. And this is what's going on is the symptom. Israel as an occupying power is an aggressive controlling Palestinians by force, killing them by bombs, by starvation, besieging them, displacing them. So this is, like I said in the introduction, this is part of going on West Bank also. This is part of the Israeli ethnic as an apartheid regime. We see how Israel unleashes the American settlers onto Palestinian lands, destroying farms, uprooting olive trees. In the past 6 years, or close to trees were uprooted by the occupation and the settlers. So what's going on here is, again, Israel is destroying our means of lives, sending us back decades and decades, because Israel doesn't want us to live, doesn't want us to ask for our freedom, doesn't want to even protest as we are being killed.
Rifat, again, to everybody watching, we're speaking to Ref ElAri. He's in Gaza, speaking to us by phone, and experiencing these intense airstrikes that have been pummeling Gaza for the last 5 or maybe 6 days now. Rifat, I'm curious, the feeling on the ground in Gaza, in terms of, how are people feeling? Obviously, I'm sure there's a lot of fear, but, there's also been on the other end, I think that this is the first time Palestinian resistance groups in Gaza have managed to launch this far into Israel with rocket fire. There's definitely, we see scenes that we've never seen. There's people in Tel Aviv, right, like running for bomb shelters. So this is certainly demonstrates a level of increased capability for the resistance, for the armed factions in Gaza. What's the sentiment from your perspective on the ground about the military reaction that they've been able to launch from Gaza?
The situation, it depends and varies. It's been very tough the first 2 days, and Israel is doing this deliberately because in the first 3 days there was a lot of trade. People were bragging, even people critical of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other resistance movements. They were like dazzled at how sophisticated they are. This could be when we are besieged, when we are controlled by Israel, when we have nobody to support us, to give us the weapons like and the billions of dollars like America doing with. So because of this sophistication and even the intelligence the resistance has, flying some kind of drones against Israeli soldiers, targeting is and even warning civilians, so to speak, that we're going to bomb in an hour, or we're going to bomb at 9 p.m. sharp, and bombing at 9 p.m. sharp, and striking. Generally, as a Palestinian, I'm usually for violence, for boycotting Israel, for sanctioning Israel, for divesting from Israel. But when we are put in this situation, we are all resistance, and I think this is a sentiment that is everywhere in Gaza, and Israel sees this and knows this, and Israel wants to push us to despair by all the devastation and it's wreaking throughout the whole Gaza Strip. So this is an insane occupation that has gone beyond imagination. Just to prove a point, Netanyahu and his rivals to gain more Israeli vote in the coming election.
No, I think. I'm sorry, Rania. Go ahead.
We keep having this issue. I'm sorry, Eugene.
No, it's fine.
Is there anything else you wanted to ask, Eugene? I'm sorry. You seem like you wanted to get something in.
No. I think that was. No, please go ahead.
So Rifat, we want to try to see because what you're saying is very, very important, and we want to ask you a couple more questions, but I think we're going to try and see if we can actually have you turn off the camera so that maybe the audio streams better, because we're having a couple technical glitches with the audio, and we really, really want people to hear what you're saying. Is it possible to turn off your video? Yeah, just stop your video. Okay, it's off now. So let's see, Rifat, can you say something so we can check if your audio got a little bit better?
Now better?
Let's see. Because I think what you were saying is really important. It sounds like people in Gaza, of course, Israel's campaign is designed to make people suffer so much that they demand that that Hamas stop firing rockets. But I will say, I mean, how what's your perspective of somebody inside Gaza? I'm sure you've probably been seeing some of the things that have been happening around Palestine, right? Where you have protests erupting across the West Bank. There's been protests inside 48 Palestine, which is quite unprecedented. And yesterday there was people at the border in Lebanon trying to get into Palestine. There was people at the border from Jordan, both Palestinians and Jordanians, trying to make their way into the West Bank. Did you see these images? And if so, what was your feeling when you saw them?
Of course, I'm following the news on social media, mainly on social media, because of the horrible mainstream media coverage. What happened in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, this really for Palestinians. We've seen how the people of Yemen went to the streets out in support of Palestine and Gaza and Jerusalem. Made us really feel proud that we belong to this. Like we can share the common struggle, the global struggle for freedom. and people going out to the streets in Chicago, in New York, in America, in Europe, in Manchester, in Paris, where they were attacked by the French police, in Turkey, in many other places around the world. This proves that Palestinian is part of the global and part of the struggle against colonial, settler colonial occupation. And I've said this, always said this. I was just asked a question. Hear me?
Yes.
We have you.
It's a little spotty, but yeah, we can hear you.
I was asked by somebody why aren't the people out to the streets like it happened with George Floyd? I said, please stop, don't do this. This is wrong. The Palestinian struggle is part of the Black Lives struggle. We are in this together, complement each other. We build on their struggle. We support theirs. We don't, there's no option at all with the struggle of people in America and elsewhere, because this is a battle for justice, for freedom. It's a battle for human rights.
Well, Rifat, we really appreciate you joining us live there from Gaza and bringing us the perspective of people there on the ground. We know it's late there as well, so really appreciate you giving us some time. And please, I mean, I know it's difficult, but we hope you can stay safe.
I'll do my best.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Well, that was Ref ElAri, who is the author of Gaza Writes Back, Rania. I mean, a number of very interesting things that he noted. I mean, setting that what is happening there is so intense in terms of the airstrikes and the artillery fire that's killed at least 140 people so far, wounded nearly 1,000 so far, that it's setting Gaza back 100 years, decades and decades, that it's extraordinarily violent, even when compared to some of the things that stand out in our mind in 2014 and 2008, and the major wars that have marked Palestine. Well, in many ways, I think you said maybe not even wars, brutal assaults, maybe the better way to describe them. But obviously a harrowing situation there on the ground in Gaza that is continuing. I mean, that's the other piece of it, Rania, is that there's been so much carnage so far. It shocked the world in many ways, and it's still ongoing. We saw the destruction of a building with Al Jazeera and the Associated Press today, and here we are, yet another night in Gaza, where I think we can expect that, you know, as we go through the rest of the day, it will only get worse.
Yeah, no, it's definitely seems that, you know, Israel is really trying to, you know, what we know is that the Israelis are looking to end this conflict as soon as possible, is what we're hearing. Whether that'll happen, it's not, you know, 100%. But when they're about to end a conflict, what they're doing is they're trying to reestablish their deterrence, is what they call it. And the reason they feel they have to do that is because Palestinians have hit back hard. They've fought back hard. You've seen rockets raining down on central Israel, in some cases in northern Israel. You have, you know, these images coming out of Tel Aviv of people just repeatedly having to run to bomb shelters. The spokesperson for the resistance in Gaza is saying that they can go for 6 months if they have enough weapons to do this, for 6 months if they have to. So they're really putting out this message of strength to try to strike fear into Israel, that you can't just keep doing this to us and we don't hit back. And let's also remember that the resistance factions in Gaza hit Israel with rocket fire, not in response to Gaza being bombed initially, but in retaliation for what was happening in occupied East Jerusalem.
Right.
That's where this all started, is the Israelis started this provocation where they've been for weeks ramping up their campaign to try to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from occupied East Jerusalem, specifically with relation to the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, which has made international headlines, where Israel's been trying to force out these Palestinian families and replace them with these extremist Jewish settlers, which is pretty much, you know, how Israel was founded, with ethnically cleansing Palestinians and replacing them with Jewish settlers. And so this garnered the attention of the international media, of international officials. And then on top of that, there was ongoing escalations and provocations at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, a very important site to Palestinian nationalism, to Palestinians in general. And the Israelis, you know, these extremist Israeli settlers also have this thing called the Temple Mount movement, which seeks to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and replace it and rebuild over it a third Jewish temple to try to bring about the end times. And so the reason I bring all this up is just to note that this was pretty unprecedented, this kind of solidarity across these different sort of ghettos of Palestine, right? Israel, today's Nakba Day, so it's a good time to talk about the fact that, you know, Israel has spent the last 73 years trying to carve up Palestine into smaller and smaller ghettos. You know, there's the Palestinians in Gaza under air, land, and sea blockade who are bombed every few years. There's Palestinians in the West Bank who are under this very physical Israeli military occupation, in addition surrounded by Jewish settlements. And then there's Palestinians in 48 Palestine who are treated as second-class citizens, are discriminated against, are currently experiencing these sort of pogroms that we're going to have somebody to come talk about shortly. But just to say that the fact that you had resistance factions in Gaza responding with rocket fire to something that was happening to Palestinians in Jerusalem, it just shows you that the struggle for Palestine continues to be a struggle among Palestinians across these geographical locations that they've been separated into.
Well, one of the things that I think is going to be very interesting, Rania, and you mentioned the issue of how long this could go, the possibility of the resistance saying in Gaza that they could go for 6 months, is exactly the issue of Sheikh Jarrah. I mean, the Israelis and the diplomatic reports, allegedly they claim they want to end this quickly, but I don't know how quickly it can happen. I think that we've seen pretty consistently from the Palestinian factions and forces that there is a strong belief that unless there is a resolution of this attempt to force people out of Sheikh Jarrah, unless they are protected, that this uprising will not end. And I think that it's one of those situations where the Israelis have now painted themselves into a corner, and they're saying, that, you know, we're going to have complete calm, as you say, that we're going to restore our deterrence, that we're going to have total quiet. But I don't think that there's really any ability for them to do so without launching a much wider conflict, perhaps. And certainly it seems at the diplomatic level that there is not a lot of hope for a ceasefire, given the fact the Israelis so far don't actually want to negotiate. Their only position is that the Palestinians should stop resisting their brutal attacks that have killed 140 people at least in the Gaza Strip, and a number of people in the West Bank. And of course, as you mentioned, these pogroms that have been unleashed inside of 48 Palestine. And so I think that it's one of those situations where we're seeing these reports, partially almost a psychological warfare, to suggest that there's some desire on the part of Israel to negotiate or to pull back, when in fact I think the situation that we are in is that they are unwilling to have any form of negotiations, and the only way they want to end the conflict is either more death and more destruction, or just the complete and total capitulation of the resistance in the face of these assaults. Neither of, well, the second of which, the latter of which, seems very unlikely to happen, and the former we shall see. And obviously, I think they'd like to avoid that. But that's the nature of war: is it's harder to go, it's easier to go up the escalation ladder than down. And Israel escalated so massively, so quickly, with so many provocations. We're in a situation where I think it'll be difficult to see. And again, the UN Security Council will, of course, be meeting tomorrow, allegedly, on this issue. We'll see if anything comes of that other than speeches.
Now, as we continue to talk about this all-out assault on Palestinians, we're going to move to a different part of this this violence that's been getting very little attention, but should be getting more attention. While everyone's eyes are rightly on Gaza because of the horrific bombings of families that we're witnessing and all of the carnage that comes from that, there's also in 48 Palestine, in present-day Israel, there are Israeli Jewish settler mobs that are roaming around the streets, hunting for Arabs to beat up, to lynch, they're attacking Arab homes. They actually, yesterday there was a 12-year-old child left in critical condition, a 12-year-old Palestinian child, citizen of Israel, left in critical condition because his home in I think Jaffa was firebombed. Yeah. And they believe it was by these roving gangs of Jewish mobs that are organizing on WhatsApp, on Signal, to go into mixed Arab Jewish neighborhoods and Arab neighborhoods and basically attack Palestinians. And they appear to be doing it under some cases under the protection of the Israeli police. In other cases, the Israeli police are just standing by. So to try to make sense of this this ongoing violence against Palestinian citizens of Israel, we're joined by journalist David Sheen, who is an expert on the Israeli Jewish far right. David, thank you so much for joining the Freedom Side. It looks like we can't hear him. Are you muted, David? Maybe not. Not muted. Okay, let's try to figure out what's happening with David's audio.
Yeah, well, we'll try to see with that. If it's not muted on his end, he's checking a few things here.
Okay, well, while we can we have someone on the back end while we try to figure out what's going on with David's audio?
Well, while we're trying to figure out something that goes on with David's audio, one thing I wanted to mention here, Rania, that I think is notable, and this is, a piece of what we were hearing from Rafat when he was talking about the bombing not just being in the urban areas, but also in the agricultural lands, destroying the lands of Palestine. And, I was looking this morning at some of those young people who had been killed in these Israeli strikes, and a few that just stood out to me. On May 10th, Mohammed Suleiman, 15 years old, and his father were killed instantly by Israeli drone fire while they were working on their agricultural land outside of the city. And then also the cousins here, Raf El-Masri, 10 years old, 2-year-old Yazan El-Masri, brothers, 6-year-old and 11-year-old Marwan and Ibrahim El-Masri. So this is one whole family here, 2 cousins, 2 brothers, killed while harvesting wheat in their fields. And so this idea that comes out so often from the IDF, Rania, and that in and of itself we know is fake, but that, we're only attacking these places because there's, rockets hidden in the basement or something. Now, as much as that is obviously not the case in many of these incidents, I mean, right here, the cases of 5 young people, one as young as 2 years old, killed while harvesting crops in their fields. I mean, these are the types of direct and deliberate and aggressive provocations that Israel is doing that often don't make it into the Western press. I got that from the Turkish press. That's not in the New York Times. That's not in the Washington Post. And I don't want to excuse the firing and the destruction of the buildings, but I just want to expose the unbelievable brutality of the Israeli forces. I mean, here they are shooting down a father and his son, harvesting in them fields, shooting down 4 young people with missiles while they're harvesting wheat in their farms. I mean, it may not be unbelievable, sadly, because we've seen so many years of this. As you mentioned, Rania, it's Nakba Day, which is the commemoration in Palestine of the expulsion of nearly 1 million Palestinians in 1948. So it may not be unbelievable, but it is still outrageous.
So so we actually have a super chat donation from Olu Odefin, and he actually asks the question, do you think Benjamin Netanyahu created the situation to distract people from his corruption trial? That's a great question. We'll try to address it with now the guest that we were trying to introduce earlier, David Sheen, journalist, expert on the Israeli far right. Hopefully we figured out the audio situation. Welcome to the Freedom Side, David.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Okay, this time.
Okay, excellent.
So,
excellent.
David, thank you so much for joining us. I want to turn to, we were talking about Gaza, but I want to turn to what's happening inside Israel right now. You in particular, you were, for those who are watching, we did an interview with David for Breakthrough News last week before all of this got so crazy. And we talked about the Israeli far right and what that means in Israeli society, and Israeli society's lurch to the right. So after this live stream, I encourage people to go watch that. But David, I'm so glad we get a chance to have you back on because, you live in a mixed neighborhood. You're in Haifa. And, we've heard Arabs there are being attacked by Jewish mobs. Can you describe what you've heard or seen in recent days and what's taking place there?
Well, in Haifa, like in other towns in the country in which there's a significant population of both Jews and Palestinians, there's only a few of them, a handful of them. But in those towns, those have been the towns where you've had the most intense violence in recent days. Now, first, just a quick reminder that those towns used to be Palestinian towns, and then when Israel was created during the 1948 war, the Nakba that you spoke of earlier, most of the Palestinian was expelled, driven out, and some stayed, and over the years, Jewish immigrants were settled in those cities and in some of those homes of former Palestinians. But in any case, that's how we get to a situation. When we talk about mixed cities, we're still talking about mostly Jewish and maybe 20% Palestinian, which is approximately the population of Israel that are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. They're about 20% of the population. So in any case, in those few towns where you have significant populations of both of them, they're not just one or the other, we have, as you mentioned, groups of Jewish supremacists who are openly plotting on social media channels to arm up, put together weapons, both cold weapons such as brass knuckles, knives, also people talking about explosives and guns, and organizing in groups, planning where to meet, when to meet, in areas where they believe there will be Palestinian citizens of Israel walk by, or whether it's a business owned by or funded by, or in some cases, simply neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods, where they'll walk through, knock on doors, either climb out, mark the door to, once they've established whether it's or not, and then message to the next round of pogrom through, or simply that very night, just kind of knock on the door, then bash their way through. What we saw most often was not bashing into people's homes, although we saw sickening videos of that, but we also saw in recent nights, and we've seen truly in recent years, it's a phenomenon that's quite common where Jewish supremacists who aim to attack Palestinians will walk around a city that's mixed, such as Jerusalem. They'll walk up to a person who may or may not be Palestinian, or it's not obvious, and they'll say, "Hey, what's up? Do you have the time? Or can I have a cigarette?" Or some innocuous question like that. They will get the person, to say a few words in Hebrew, and then as soon as they hear the person's answer, if Arabic accent, then they immediately understand that person is not Jewish, they're Palestinian, and then they mob them, they bum rush them, and they beat them and bludgeon them. So we've seen that, in recent years in Jerusalem by these, anti-miscegenation patrols of the far right that aim to ethnically cleanse Israel's mixed cities and the country as a whole of non-Jews, of Palestinians, indigenous Palestinians. But we see this now, migrating in recent times into the so-called mixed cities, mainly on the coastal plain and close to it. So this is a real uptick in the level of violence, and in terms of the collusion between Israeli police and Jewish supremacists, we see this most often actually in the West Bank. This is a phenomenon that's very, very common there, where Israeli settlers in the West Bank wearing masks will attack Palestinian farmers, shepherds, working in their fields, such, or walking for whatnot. And as the Palestinians are attacking the settlers, you see Israeli soldiers walking amongst them, as if they just happen to be two different gangs that are cooperating with each other in some kind of melee attack, on joint attack on Palestinians, where the Israeli army is essentially giving armed cover to the settler terrorists. So if that phenomenon was common in the West Bank in recent years, we see that being imported into so-called Israel proper, into 1948 Israel, in Israeli cities, where Palestinians are being attacked by Jewish mobs, and Jewish police are, walking amongst them and shooting shock grenades at those same Palestinians.
And David,
it's obvious
really
shocking. That they're
Oh, go ahead. It's really shocking, just the extent of it, because it appears, this is happening in areas across Israel. I mean, in Jaffa, I saw an interview with a couple of young Palestinians who, one girl was saying, it was an Al Jazeera interview, but it was in Arabic. I haven't seen any of this kind of stuff in English at all. It's barely being covered. But this one young woman was saying that in her neighborhood, basically a gang of like a militia, a Jewish militia, what seemed to be like a Jewish militia, settler militia, came into the neighborhood and ransacked some of the houses that Palestinians lived in. And then on their way out, they actually marked the house with red paint to so that other people would know an Arab family lives here. I mean, this to me is reminiscent of like Bosnia, of actually also reminiscent of something ISIS did and some of the other jihadi groups that had operated in Iraq and Syria over the last decade. They would mark the homes of, you know, minorities, of Christians, of Shias, so they could later go kick them out or take over or hurt them. And so this is really reminiscent. And, you know, it's people when Americans think of Israel, they think of this, you know, country that is very reflective of what America is, you know, very kind of like normal Western country. But this sounds like what would happen if like the Proud Boys took over or if the KKK took over. And it's really disturbing because then I look at what's happening in Israel from leadership, and not only are they not addressing it, you know, Netanyahu came out and gave a speech essentially saying that police in Lod, where there have been some of these, this intercommunal violence, that they don't have to worry about investigations if they go too far, right? Just do what's necessary. And you've got all this incitement from other Israeli figures who are in positions of political power, and they're basically just complaining about attacks on Jews, not about the attacks on Arabs, which are far more widespread, seem to have state backing. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit of like where this comes from? Because you mentioned this is normal, right, in the West Bank. It's normal over the years. We remember years ago when these extremists in Jerusalem would ask Palestinians, you know, oh, can I have a cigarette, to see if they what accent they answer with so they can beat them up. But like you mentioned, this is relatively new to be happening in Israel. And when I talked to you last, you mentioned to me that there are settler organizations that have been actually intentionally moving settlers into these mixed Arab Jewish towns. Can you talk a little bit more about that? When did that start happening and why?
Sure. So the phenomenon you're describing, it began approximately 15 years ago. As I previously said, at that time, Israel withdrew its bases and its settler population as a strip. And when that happened, it was a total moral blow to the Israeli settler movement, because in their minds, Israel should only ever expand the territories under its control. It should never, by any circumstances, you know, give back territories that it took by force. And so when that happened, you know, of course, in the run-up to it, they engaged in massive protests, you know, and civil disobedience, and attempting to convince the government and the population to pressure the government to cancel that withdrawal. They were not successful in doing so for a bunch of reasons, mainly because the Gaza Strip consists of something like 2 million Palestinians, and at the time, about 5,000 Israeli settlers. They were just a teeny tiny percentage of the population for most, and most of them were religious. For most of the population, secular, they just couldn't see the cost-benefit analysis in continuing to military occupation of so many Palestinians for the benefit of just a few religious settlers. So the religious camp failed to stop that withdrawal. And they vowed then that they would never allow that to happen again. Of course, the way that they would prevent any further withdrawal and, you know, turn the dial in the other direction so that Israel could continue expanding again was to send its best youth to try to capture positions of power, to cultural institutions, government institutions, educational institutions, you know, building you know, networks of think tanks in order to put people in key positions culturally so that their ideas would filter down to the Israeli electorate, so that they would become embraced by larger segments of the Israeli population. Now, when I say their values, meaning their values elimination, because, meaning the desire to ethnically cleanse the country. You know, the Israeli society, as I said, the Israeli government ruled by Netanyahu, the largest portion of the Israeli electorate or the Israeli political body is the domination camp, those that support apartheid, one state solution in which one group, ethnic group, Jews, have more privileges, rights and privileges than the non-Jews in the population, and ethnocracy in the state. So that's the largest percentage of the Israeli population supports apartheid. But the second biggest portion of the Israeli Jewish population is the elimination camp. And they don't want to see the state of Israel from the sea, from the river to the sea. You know, it wants to see that state of Israel in those borders, but ethnically cleansed of non-Jews. That means half the country to ethnically cleanse millions of people, the Palestinian population. And sadly, these values are not rare in Israeli society. If you look at Pew polls, okay, so not no random small company and that just popped up last week, but very respected polling organization surveyed Israeli people, Israeli Jews, just a couple of years ago, and they asked them straight up, do you support kicking non-Jews out of the Arabs, out of the country? And 48% of Israeli Jews said yes, they wanted to drive non-Jews out of the country. That's what they believed should happen. That's frightening. And every single day ever since, that statistic has been deleted from the memory of any journalist who reports on this country. No one reports on Israeli society ever say that half of the popular Israeli Jews wants to ethnically cleanse the non-population of the country. It's just never spoken about, but it's the important factor to understand what's happening on the ground. That because of this death wish, many people will support the government. Now, in recent years, the government has felt emboldened by Trump administration, so it could be even more racist. And, it's ridden on waves of racism. And just to go back to the settler groups that we originally started talking about, since the mid-2000s, you have the government actually sponsoring settler groups, as you mentioned, to move from the settlements, where they were driving Palestinians out of their home. West Bank, Palestinians don't have citizenship or just any to elect the people that control their lives under military occupation. So after doing that in the West Bank, then the idea is, oh no, it's not, how have we left behind the cities in Israel itself? We've allowed Arab people to populate, in other words, to repopulate. They're having children, they're building businesses, they're, living and creating cultural institutions. We don't want Arabic people in the country. We don't want Arab people in the country, Palestinian people in the country. And we don't want the population of the country to suffer their presence. So the idea of these settler groups is to move back from the settlements into Israel proper, so-called, and in those cities with government funding, they establish religious seminaries. And the idea is to convince the local population of Jews to separate from their Arab neighbors, to, if there are mixed, romantic relationships between Jews and non-Jews, and the rare instances when these occur, to try to break up these families. This anti-miscegenation agenda.
There's actually attempts to break up mixed families. There's actually attempts to break up mixed families. Jeez.
The objective of these groups, the declared objective of these groups that are funded by the Israeli government to the tune of millions of shekels annually. So only, sorry, just to add one more thing to this.
Not only, please finish your point. Yes.
Okay, so not only does the Israeli government pay these eliminationist settlers to move back into Israel proper and to establish institutions there at the expense of the local Palestinian population, taking over buildings in the neighborhoods where they barely have anywhere to find a place of their own, and then take over an institution that the state has taken from the local Palestinian population decades ago, give it to one of these religious groups. So they're now in the middle of a mixed Palestinian Jewish population. Incite racism, ramp up ultranationalist sentiment, and carry out anti-miscegenation propaganda. And get paid by the government, if you can believe this, to actually go into Israeli school where secular students, secular Jews are studying in high school, and to go into those schools and to teach those students what is Judaism. So they're going to learn about the Jewish, so young Jews, young Israeli Jews are going to learn about what is the Jewish religion from the Jewish eliminationists whose objective drive Jews out of the country, drive mixed Jewish, non-Jewish families apart. These are the people that they pay to go into Israeli schools and teach secular Jews what the values of Judaism by their perspective, and of course the most extreme interpretation of it. So this is a sick situation that precipitates the insane violence that we've seen in recent days.
Yeah, that's how you're able to get, and I believe the death toll now, the update that Breakthrough News is getting is 145 people, Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, including 41 children.
And that's
41
just
children.
The past hour, really, just five more deaths overall, 2 more of children in just the past hour. It undoubtedly will continue to grow.
David, is there any part of Israeli society that speaks out against this? Are there any voices? Is there even a conversation in the media? Are there people are there leftists? Are there Israeli leftists on the ground against this war? And then, that's one set of it, but then also with what's happening to Palestinians inside the country, do they have any protection, or are they just completely defenseless and at the mercy of these eliminationists?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are some Israeli Jews who are disgusted by what's happening, by these phenomena. They would like to live in peace with their non-Jewish neighbors. Those do include different types of Jews. There are some, let's say, in the small liberal camp who would like to see a 2-state solution. Most of those folks are, grossed out by the idea of, racist violence against Palestinians. And then, of course, we have socialist Jews who would like to see not a separate state solution where Jews are in one state and Palestinians are in another state and they're ethnically cleansed from each other's states. Socialist Jews would like to see one state from the river like there is now, except that it can be completely equal, no racism, no state-sponsored racism, and including, that means the repatriation of Palestinian refugees who were expelled by Israel. So there are some Jews who would like to see that as the solution that the state prescribed. But that's not what's going to happen, because the amount of Jews who feel that way are so few. A teeny tiny fraction of Israeli society, 10%, 5%. It's hard to put a figure on it exactly, but we're talking about a very small fraction, and we can see that manifested in the Israeli elections. A couple of years ago, I did an analysis of all the Israeli national elections that were held since the year 2000, and I analyzed how the specific votes in each of them, and then I found that consistently, this is, it hasn't changed. Israeli society, 60 to 65% vote apartheid parties, domination camp, about 20% vote for the religious parties, the elimination camp. But there's only about 15, maybe 5 Israeli society voting for 2-state option, and there's maybe 10% of Israeli society, 15% or something like that, 10, 12% voting for one-state solution. Of course, that's a very rough calculation, but that's, the results. Not only were, I was able to, predict that, wow, this has happened consistently since the year 2000, but then since that 2-year ago lecture that I gave, we've had 4 Israeli elections in the years, and every single election has followed the exact same format consistently, every single thing, the same numbers again and again. What I predicted then has followed suit for 4 consecutive elections. So it seems to be, that's the vein that's running through society. Of society of apartheid, and scary 1/5 of the wants ethnic cleansing.
I wanted to ask you, well, first of all, let me ask you this. Has there been this kind of communal violence? And that's like a very light term I'm using, but I guess it's also accurate. Communal violence or communal mobilization against Palestinian citizens of Israel. Has this ever happened before? And I do want to note there are, of course, like in places like Lod, there are Arabs also fighting Jews. Like in some places, there's kind of young hooligans. This is translating into young hooligans, young Jewish hooligans, young Arab hooligans also fighting each other, which is quite dangerous and kind of gives you the idea of, oh, this is like civil war like. I also did see, you know, there was some images coming out of Jaffa of what looked like Jewish militias asking people for IDs or checking their IDs. But have these kinds of things happened before that you can recall inside the country?
Every so often we will hear about another incident of just like a random, you know, Palestinian family that was just like, or Palestinian friends that were just like walking down the street and were all of a sudden brutally attacked. So brutal attacks on Palestinian citizens of Israel are not, you know, they're not rare. They do happen. They regularly punctuate our lives here in Israel. But what we've seen in the last few days is certainly an explosion. And part of that is to do with the fact that Netanyahu has mainstreamed the most racist and most murderous in modern Jewish history, the Kahana movement. The last 2 years, he worked very hard to bring them into the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. And in this last election, he was successful. And he managed to get them 7 Knesset seats, so 6 on their own, and then a 7th one from his own party. He promised them a seat from his own party. Imagine this, the most racist movement. They've murdered 50 plus Palestinians in Palestine in the last 50 years. This is a political party, okay? A political movement, but they're terrorists. They're recognized as terrorists by the US State Department. They've even been declared terrorists by government when massacred Palestine in 1994. The Baruch Goldstein massacre at the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. But now, you know, quarter century later, they're no longer a terrorist organization. They're now in the Israeli parliament with the Israeli government, partners of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And of course, they've always been the vanguard, pushing Israel further and further to the far right. But now they have the legitimacy of being in the parliament. And it's also important to note, though, that this wasn't something that occurred overnight. The alliance between the Likud party, Netanyahu's ruling Likud party, and the Kahanists has been going on for some time, but it's just been a little bit under the surface. It's been on the down low. The most obvious example of this is who is the non-financial patron of Benjamin Netanyahu? Okay, well, if we calculate, if we count the newspaper that that Sheldon Adelson spent like $1 billion on to float, or billion shekels rather, to constantly propagandize Israelis to support Netanyahu. That's $1 billion of, you know, bribery, corruption that supports Netanyahu's, you know, stint in office. But then let's say the next largest funder of Netanyahu's political campaigns is the family. They're an American family, American Jewish family, you know, multi-gajillionaires in the US, and they are the #1 contributors, financial contributors to the political campaigns of Benjamin Netanyahu. They are also the #1 contributors. They are the funders of the Flag Day, the Death to the Arabs parade that we talked about last time. Yes, every year, the Falik family are the #1 funders of this, you know, state-sponsored event, but they often pick up. And I've seen family members standing on top of, you know, with ministers being given the speech of honor, you know, the keynote speech at the peak of Jerusalem Day, when they have these Flag Day parades at the end of a day of, you know, banging on Arab shopkeepers' stores and screaming death to the Arabs. So the same family, the same Zionist family that are the funders of Netanyahu's political campaigns, are the #1 funders of the Death to the Arabs Day marches. And they are the #1 funders of the Kahanists, the anti-miscegenationist group Lehava, the Kahanist black shirt gangs that patrol Israeli cities trying to break up mixed relationship, you know, romantic relationships between Jews and Arabs. And they're the ones that have been leading the pogroms that have been going on in recent months against Palestinians, whether it's in the West Bank or in Jerusalem, and now we see in Israel proper, keeping in mind that although the Kahanists are not a mass movement, they're a teeny, tiny, small section of Israeli society, but clearly they tap into a vein, a sentiment that is much more widespread in Israeli society. So they're always pushing that knob to the further and further to the far right. Meanwhile, instead of spewing them out as the racists that they are, Netanyahu over time does triple backflip to bring them into the government, giving them parliamentary immunity so that they can now use that immunity to incite more violence, have greater platforms from which to incite ethnic cleansing against Palestinians.
So I wanted to ask you, well, first I just want to make a note of the kinds of incitement that comes. I don't know what party this guy belongs to, the public security minister, which is basically like the head of the police, I guess, Amir Ohana. He called, so there was an Israeli Jewish man who was arrested in connection with the deadly shooting of an Arab Israeli man at protest earlier in the week in Lod, which is what kicked off this recent spate of violence inside of Israel and 48 Palestine. And so this man was arrested, and the public security minister Amir Ohana condemned his arrest. Okay, this man who was connected with shooting a Palestinian citizen of Israel. But he went even further, and he essentially called these these lynch mobs, he called them force multipliers for the Israeli police. So this is the kind of language we're hearing from Israeli officials, basically sanctioning like these groups, these mobs, and telling them, "Good, it's good you exist. You're helping the police. You're a force multiplier." So that's really disturbing. I want to ask you about about this violence taking place against Palestinian citizens. It seems to be the kind of worst and most widespread, at least that I've ever seen watching from afar. But now that the genie's out of the bottle, how do you, can it be put back in? Is this going to continue? There's no one protecting Palestinians. You have these Israeli officials essentially saying, yeah, great. Is there any effort by the state, aside from the police just either standing idly by or actually escorting these people as they commit this violence against Palestinian citizens? Is there any attempt to put a lid on it? How is the Israeli press and how is the Israeli government talking about it?
Okay, so we've got a few things to unpack there. First of all, you mentioned Internal Security Minister, or rather the Police Minister, Amir Ohana, and he, as you mentioned, he's been, basically saying that, it's like the Wild West, and saying that Jewish people should carry guns, more Jews should carry guns, and they should be patrolling, and they should be feeling free to shoot. Just Netanyahu, soldiers rather should feel free. So Ohana is saying the citizens should feel free to shoot. Basically saying it's a free-for-all on that their blood to the highest bidder, I suppose. It's really, really, really violent and very big stuff. And as far as I understand, this could be makeable to war crimes charges in an international court if we ever something. And in fact, this has been Ohana's position not only in the last few, but in several months, for the last several months, when Kahane rally started occurring, starting in, let's say, December 20, we had a month straight where just every other day there were, lynches or near lynches of Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And, all of these, if you can, this month-long pogromathon going on against anti-Palestinian pogromathon, what was it touched off by? You'd imagine, it must have been some Palestinian attacking Jews, and hurting Jews and killing Jews. And because of that, the Israeli far right must have been enraged and got treated and started. No. It wasn't that. What caused their rage? They got them out every night, thousands of people protesting and taking Palestine and beating them. What was it that drove them so mad? Well, it turns out that one of their own, a Kanahanist, teenager, one of the members of this terrorist group, was attacking Palestinians. He was throwing stones at passing Palestinian cars, a crime that if a Palestinian does it to a Jew, He's charged with attempted murder for doing so.
Right.
So you have young Israeli Kahanists, meaning that they openly support ethnic cleansing, physically attacking Jews. Cops, in a rare instance, actually drove by, saw what they were doing, started chasing them. This Kahanist teenager drives away full tilt, and in such haste to get away that he actually flips the car off the road. Car crashes and kills him. Okay, so now because this Kahanist, who again openly supports ethnically cleansing the country of non-Jews, because he was attacking Palestinians and while fleeing from police from that attacking of Palestinians, because he himself got himself killed, he has now become a martyr. And this continually happens. The far right turns Jews who have the most right to their martyr, turn them around and they'll go to the American media and they'll say, look, Jews have died. Jews. Now, of course, attacks on all sides, there is violence against Jewish people in this country, but the lives that they're holding up as these paragons of virtue. So often Kahanist rabbis who have a long track record of moving into the settlements, harassing the local population, or in the case of some of them, like this rabbi from a couple of years ago, he actually was one who moved into the mix, rabbi who moved into Tiv, and he would harass African refugees, another non-Jewish Israeli. He would take a father and son, a boy that looks brown, that looks black, follow them, thinking that the African is going to sexually assault the boy, and it turns out it's his father. How they pester and persecute non-Jewish people and mixed race people in the country. They try to harass and harangue them and drive them out of the country along with the non-Jews. The non-Jews and the mixed families can go with them. So these people are valorized. They're held up as paragons. They're turned into their martyrs. And this is when all this is happening. So this Kahanist gets killed while flipping his car. What does people are protesting in the streets? Kahanists screaming, "We want justice. We want you to break up the police unit that tracks settler movements. We don't even want there to be any police following and settler activities. Close the whole thing." And then Netanyahu called the family of the Kahanist, and Ohana, the police minister, called the family of the Kahanist to express their sorrow and to visit them in their time of mourning, and to these are the people that get the attention of Israel's most powerful political leaders, the people with the vilest political opinions. This is the current Israeli government. And it's not changing anytime soon, but everything I've said in the last half hour or so, you would have no idea if all you ever watch is the mainstream media. Because they won't speak about this.
No, they play this role where they try to cover up the dirty side, right? This is the dirty side of what Israel's becoming. And they do their best to try to I even had somebody making the argument that, Israel, what it's doing in Gaza is really awful, but the alternative to that is an Islamic State run by Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. And obviously that's absurd. First of all, Iran and Hezbollah aren't even in Israel, but that's beside the point. It's also, obviously, if giving Palestinians equal rights doesn't mean they're gonna vote Hamas into power. But aside from that absurd aspect of it, what makes that comment so ironic is that you're talking about this kind of racist, right-wing, religious, messianic movement growing in power in politics in Israel. And it's what do you think they're trying to impose? I mean, they're not going to be able to impose it because there are still a lot of people in Israel that are secular, but they're not exactly trying to impose a secular state themselves. These people are theocrats. Yeah. Maybe Netanyahu isn't, but some of the people he's allying with are. Exactly.
Netanyahu himself is secular, but a lot of the people he's allying himself with are not only, as I've said, do they want Israel to control all the land and then some, not only do they want to kick the non-Jews out of that entire territory, but they also want to turn that whole territory to Jewish dominion, to a religious monarchy in which the country is ruled by a king with a council of rabbis who, rule according to most repressive dictates of, the medieval dictates of the Talmud, 1,000 years ago, almost 2,000 years ago, and of course only the most extreme racist reactionary versions of it. This is not insubstantial segment of the Israeli relation. Sure, Palestinians also have what we could call an eliminationist camp as well. I'm sure I'm not an expert on Arab affairs or on Palestinian society. I know that there's, just like every society, there are some who are in that eliminationist camp who want to eliminate non-Jew or eliminate non-Palestinians, eliminate Jews from the country, certainly. But it's the Israeli eliminationist camp, the Jewish eliminationist camp that has the power, that fills the Israeli army, that has that has its finger on the nuclear button, that is receiving state funds to instruct Israeli youth to embrace these eliminationist values. So I don't see how we can compare. Sure, there's some Palestinians, but from my experience, living side by side with Palestinians, most Palestinians want to have equal rights with everyone they're living with, and feel that they benefit from living in a multicultural society where only Christians or only Muslims or only Palestinians or only Arabs. That's at least my sense of having lived with Palestinian citizens of Israel as my neighbors. So I'm not frightened, and I think that these calls like, so we can't ever see a democracy, Jewish people don't deserve to live in democracy. Forever, Jewish people will always have to live under a fascist regime in which non-Jews are either subhuman, or kicked out altogether, because because Arabs are such beasts that can't live with their neighbors in peace and harmony because they're physically incapable of doing so. This is the discipline in Israeli society, I'm embarrassed to say. And it's not only the top religious leaders, it's not only the top political leaders, you also see top media figures where you have top Israeli journalists, big, fat salaries, and they're speaking openly on Israeli media channels, calling for, let's just mini genocide here, mini genocide here. Let's just ethnically cleanse. Let's just destroy this entire neighborhood. Or,
meanwhile, on American TV, you have these polished spokespeople who have every euphemism in the book to explain why it's okay to just carpet bomb children in Gaza. And I think it's important for people to recognize this same mentality that's being diverted or moved against Palestinian citizens of Israel has always been implemented against Palestinians in Gaza in the West Bank. There's no other explanation for why it's okay to just take out entire families in Gaza without this underlying view of Palestinians as subhuman. And it's okay to kill their children. I guess I want to one last thing I want to ask you about, because this is something you've done so much work on. And while of course the media lens isn't on this issue and hasn't been for a while, you've done a lot of work on the way that this is played out against African non-Jews in Israel. What is the situation for non-Jewish Africans, asylum seekers? They're still in Israel. They've experienced extreme discrimination, and maybe, I don't know how you would compare it to what happens to Palestinians, if there's a totem pole of who gets it the worst, but what is the situation for them right now?
Wow.
No,
that's a huge, sorry.
No, I'm sorry, David. I apologize here. We just wanted to cut in. I thank you for joining us, but we also have with us Dr. Medhed Abbas, who is with the International Department of the Gaza Ministry of Health. We weren't able to get him on video, but we do have him here on the phone. Dr. Abbas, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome, sir.
Well, just give us a sense of what the situation is here on the ground in Gaza.
Well, the situation is very bad now. I'm hearing too much explosions. I don't know what's happening around us tonight. The situation is very dangerous. The problem is that usually the Israeli attacks are targeting domestic zones in Gaza, which is explaining why on the sixth day we have more than 1,000 injured and 139 killed.
Wow.
Among those who were killed, there have been 39 children and 22 women. And among the injured, 50% of them were women and children. Can you hear what's going on around us now? It's 12 a.m. almost now in Gaza, at midnight, and the situation is very dangerous, and there is no safe route for the civilians. The people flee their homes and go to UNRWA schools, and there is no safe place to stay in Gaza now. And they are attacking towers, attacking governmental locations, attacking banks, attacking houses. You don't know at what time they will attack your area. And because Gaza is a very tiny strip of land, it's only 360 kilometers square, and it's inhabited by 2 million population. It's highly dense area, and it's much more crowded than Mumbai and Cairo, by the way. For that reason, any attack would certainly harm too much people, and this is explaining why we have this large number of casualties and large number of deaths. And the capacity of the hospitals in Gaza is almost only 2,200 beds. This is all what we have. So if those numbers continue like this, mounting and increasing, the health of system in Gaza, it will certainly collapse.
And
too much explosions, they are very loud.
And we heard several of those. We heard several of those in the background. What is this situation?
I live in a tower. I live in the 7th floor at the seaside in Gaza City, so we can hear everything and we can see from our windows. There's a big battle of missiles landing and going up. We don't know what the hell is going on, but the situation is very dangerous now in Gaza around me.
And what is the psychological impact for people there? Are you able to sleep? Are you able to have any normal?
We have not slept. I haven't slept for the last 5 days. You try to sleep for a few minutes, then a big explosion occurs, then you got tachycardia, your heart rate starts to beat strongly, and you wake up, and there are patients, and there are children, and there are aged people. That's very dangerous. The sounds, I couldn't describe to you. May God bless you all that you never passed through such an experience, but it's really very bad. And of course, I'm receiving too much calls to explain what happens in Gaza, but it's a tragedy against civilians. It's a disaster. There should be an immediate end. We have even now, most of the time we have no electricity. We used to receive 120 megawatt from Israel. Today, because of the explosions, we lost 100 megawatt and we have only 20 left. In the hospitals, now we are relying on generators. Of course, there is no fuel for those generators because the borders are sealed. And soon the generators will stop of the hospitals, and we have no enough electricity to run the hospitals. As you know, we've been living in a siege for more than 15 years today, and Corona has arrived to Gaza 1.5 years ago. So Corona plus a siege, and now we have this aggression. Imagine what could be a situation in a community which is the poverty is prevailing. We have like 80% of our people are poor, and almost the same percent is unemployed. And on the other hand, 80% of the population rely on free food tickets from humanitarian organizations. That's the situation. So imagine, so you're speaking about, we have no harbor, we have no airport, we have no freedom. We're not free to travel like any other country in the world. Too much explosions. Maybe you can hear them now in the background. Oh my God, it's shaking my house again and again. Oh my God, there are too much explosions now occurring in Gaza City.
How is this affecting children in Gaza, Dr. Abbas?
They're scared. They are scared. There is a disaster. They have what the so-called post-traumatic stress disorder. All of them are scared. Nocturnal enuresis, they bedwetting aggression, they cry, they try to sleep with their parents, they run away with their parents, and they see The problem is that the children, they are quite sure that they are not safe because they are seeing in the television other children being killed. Last night, there is a place called a beach camp. It's a refugee camp near my house, not far from my house. In that camp, they have attacked the house yesterday, and 6 persons from the same family were killed. The father, the mother, and the children were killed. I mean, it's disaster. What's happened? They said, sorry, we're sorry for killing civilians. What does it mean, sorry? The word sorry will never, ever return back those people to life. And those who are left in those families, they will live in pain the rest of their lives. It's a disaster. That's a very bad psychological conditions in which the people are passing through. I'm quite sure that all of us now need to be treated by a psychologist.
And many people know of the blockade on Gaza. What is the situation in the hospitals in terms of medicine and other medical equipment?
We have had shortage of medicine before this aggression because of Corona and because of the siege which was imposed for us, I told you, for more than 15 years today. And the public employees are working for 50% and less of 50% of their salary every month for almost 6 years. The poverty is prevailing, and we have no enough medications, we have no enough medical supplies. When the Corona came, the situation became very miserable. You know, I used to give, as a doctor, I'm a physician, I used to give instructions to people about Corona. Okay, please buy some detergents, buy some soap, try to get, and I'm quite sure that they have no money to buy bread, you know. I'm quite sure they can buy nothing, no alcohol gel, no hygiene kit, no nothing, no nothing. They are very poor. The majority of the population are very poor because of this killer siege. So, and of course, the problem, you know, that the story which is said by the Israeli side, we are living here in the tragedy. We are trapped inside the largest air prison, which is called Gaza Strip. We are trapped. We have no freedom. They are touching our dignity. They are touching our humanitarian needs. Believe me, some people are already starving in Gaza Strip. They cannot access food. And without humanitarian organization, those people will certainly have no access to food. We have no enough potable water to drink. We have to buy potable water. Imagine what a poor man could do for his children to buy potable water without having money. The situation is very bad. And now, you know, I don't know what's the scene in Gaza streets now, because we don't get outside our homes most of the time. But the problem is that now we see in the television when there is electricity that the city we will not be able to recognize it. It's not just too much rebels everywhere. They have destroyed too much houses in hundreds. So I don't know. The infrastructure has gone. I mean, Gaza is coming back now to the Stone Age. This is what's happening now. And Benjamin Netanyahu did not deny his intention to continue this aggression in the coming days. Why the hell? He doesn't let those people live in peace. What the hell is going on? I don't know. What's his wisdom? He wants to save himself from jail by killing Palestinians. In fact, this is the only reality that every child here in Gaza knows it very well. This is the situation that we have in Gaza. This man will never, ever accept any truce or ceasefire because he wants to save himself through the war against Gaza. This is what we believe today.
And how does this compare what we're seeing now to what happened in 2014 and past experiences you have had with Israeli bombings?
Well, because, you know, the International Criminal Court decided for the previous wars to open an investigation. And that, of course, will put the Israeli leaders under risk because the ICC is not joking. They are not kidding when they say that we will open an investigation. They know because, let me tell you something. I'd like that the American people will always listen to facts and not opinions. For God's sake, look at the numbers. Look at how many children are being killed inside their beds. This is a crime against humanity. These are war crimes are being committed on televisions, and we're seeing that every day. They are attacking towers. I know those towers. I visited them 100 times in my life, you know, because I used to make interviews in televisions. So when they attack press offices, why? There is no reason. The only reason is that they don't want the truth to be seen by everybody because they're putting their cameras live and they're showing the international community what the hell is going on with the civilians in our country here. You know, 2 days ago, they were attacking the northern provinces of the Gaza Strip, you know, believe me, by Navy, by cannons, artillery bombardment, which was very heavy, and warplanes at the same time. And the day before yesterday, in particular, did you hear about the F-35? It's American-made warplane. It's a very famous one.
Mm-hmm.
I used to hear about it, but I have never even imagined what could happen with it. I read about it before, that it can attack 100 targets at the same time, and it can attack from afar that nobody can see it. That happened 2 days ago. It was 6 a.m. morning, and I saw big explosions and fire and black smokes coming from different places in my city, and I have never heard the sound of that warplane. So later on, I read in the news that the F-35 was used in Gaza Strip. Imagine that. F-35 is used to kill children in Gaza. Shame on those killers. You know, I couldn't imagine. Believe me, you would never do that to an animal. You would never accept that to any human being. You would never accept that to any creature in this life. How could they use F-35, the American-made, most advanced warplane, against civilians who are armless? This is a disaster. And if you speak about the bank of targets that they are attacking, I admit to you, sir, just bring any journalist and send him to be unbiased, not Palestinian. Bring any journalist from the United States, and you will go to see domestic areas are being attacked. There is no military target they are targeting. They are targeting only children and women. This is explaining why 50% out of 1,038 injured, 50% of them were women and children.
And if you're just tuning in, we are talking to Dr. Medhat Abbas of the International Department of Gaza's Ministry of Health. And Dr. Abbas, you just mentioned it again, but for those who maybe have just joined us, can you say, repeat, what has the death toll been so far and the toll of injuries there in the Gaza Strip?
The death toll is 138. Out of them, 38 are children. 39, sorry. 139. Out of them, 39 are really children. And the injuries are 1,038. 50% of them are women and children.
What is the impact on Gaza of the destruction of all of this civilian infrastructure? I mean, obviously there's so much death, but when the bombing does end, what will be left?
Back to the Stone Age. Gaza is returning back to the Stone Age, believe me. I mean, I couldn't imagine. I mean, you know, we love peace, and we want to live in peace, you know. The problem is that they have destroyed, you know, the gardens, even cemeteries are destroyed. They are destroying domestic zones. They are destroying shops. They are destroying. So I don't know. I can't imagine how I'll see my city again when I go back to the streets, if we will remain alive. I don't know. Believe me, but what I see in the television is horrible.
Have you seen any of the images of the large protests that are happening around the world? And if you have, how are people in Gaza reacting to the support?
Yes, yeah, we feel very happy for those who are demonstrating. But Benjamin Netanyahu, he said one day, I don't care if all Indonesia come out in the street in millions and return back home. That makes no difference for us. This is what he said.
And what is...
much difference. They do not stop.
No, very little. I mean, I wonder how you also react to the role of the United States so far, which has been to say very little, it seems.
Oh my God, Mr. Biden, when he reached when he became the president of the United States, I saw him. He's very decent. He's very polite. He feels with people. I saw him visiting poor people. I saw him visiting workers. I said, oh my God, finally, there will be a president in the United States who will support our rights. I'm quite sure that this man will never, ever accept the disaster happening to the Palestinian people. And I'm still waiting, and I hope one day he will do it.
And Dr. Abbas, you work with the health ministry. What is the impact on healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, and others who have to see all the carnage that comes through their hospitals?
Oh, they are seeing disfigured corpses of children. Believe me, one day I was in the hospital, but not in this war, in the previous war. A boy who was like 9 years old, okay? Mm-hmm. That boy, he was not a full body, he was killed, but only they brought his upper half. The lower half was not there. And they put him on the bed. Of course, he was dead. And then after a few minutes, I hear a noise outside. I was in the emergency room. I was the head of the biggest hospital at that time, called Shilka Hospital. It's located in Gaza City. That noise was the father of that child come to see his son. It was the first time for him to see him after his death. And suddenly the father started to scream, "Oh, my son! Oh, my son!" And he suddenly fainted on the ground. I saw that. You couldn't imagine losing your child. Imagine that. And he's killed by F-16 or by F-35 or I don't know. Imagine that you see your son divided into parts. That's very hard and painful. That's very hard and painful. And I don't know if those people will keep killing children and run away with their crimes. I hope that the ICC one day may put an end to those disasters because they don't care. They don't care. What they say in the TV, we are a democratic state, we love justice, we love peace, we love happy. These are lies. We just come to us, the children here in Gaza, they will tell you the reality and you will see them with your eyes.
And what will happen as the hospitals start to lose power? I know you said that it's difficult to get fuel for the generators.
I don't know, the intensive care units, the ventilators will stop. Again, dozens will die. And this is going back to the Stone Age. I mean, you will lose all the health system, of course. Everything will be lost. Operation rooms will stop. Intensive care units will stop. Kidney dialysis units will stop. Maternity hospital will collapse. And nurseries will collapse. I don't know. I haven't, seen that in my life. I haven't imagined it. I did not even study that in my medicine books, believe me. I'm a father of 4 doctors, and we're studying medicine every day and night in my life. I speak with doctors along the hour. All of them, they are discussing about patients and medications along the hour. And we have never, ever imagined that. We were talking, do you think what will happen to children? But they told me that it will be a disaster. And I'm quite sure that it will be a disaster. You are talking about the least humanitarian rights. I'm not talking about who's right and who's wrong. I'm talking about the least humanitarian rights, humanitarian needs. The basic humanitarian needs will certainly become in Gaza soon if that aggression continues like this without putting an end from the international community to Mr. Netanyahu, the famous killer in the region.
It seems that it must just be, it's hard for us, I think, to even imagine here in the United States, the mentality. I mean, it seems that there's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide in Gaza. That must be a very terrifying feeling.
There is no safe route for the people. In any war in the world, they open the door for you. If you don't want to stay, you can go, you can flee. But here in Gaza, it's a very tiny strip of land. Imagine that the people are overcrowded, 2 million population in 360 kilometers square. Imagine how density is that, Believe me, some families are living in one room with 8 family members in one room. This is existing in Gaza. This is very regular. Forget about social distancing and personal hygiene with corona. Forget about that. Most of the families here in the refugee camps, they do not know that. They flee their homes now, the people, and they are now trapped inside schools. The schools are overcrowded already, and don't tell me about social distancing again. The corona will do another job in those schools, and we will have another mounting of the numbers of corona patients in Gaza because of this overcrowding again, as a second consequence of this aggression.
Well, I think that's an important point that you make there. What are you expecting to see regarding coronavirus because of this assault?
Well, certainly the numbers will increase. I mean, if you remember at the beginning of corona in the world, I read the experiences. I read what happened in the United States, Italy, France, Spain, India, Iran. I read about many countries and what were the defects to try to avoid them in my country here. And wherever, the conclusion is that wherever there is any overcrowding, the corona will increase. It will peak immediately. It doesn't, this Indian version of the virus is very bad. It's rapidly contagious between people, moving between people quickly, and it gives you no chance, and it doesn't differentiate between young and aged. it affects all the ages, and it's much more than, it's worse than the first generation of the corona. So, of course, putting people together in schools will be another disaster expected very soon.
Dr. Abbas, one thing we see quite a bit here in the press in the United States, at least the statements from Israel and the statements from the American government, is they refuse to take responsibility for the deaths of the children, and instead they say it's the fault of the resistance, and that, in fact, it is because of the way they have set up their military element that these things are happening. I mean, how do you respond to those sorts of claims, which I think is the majority of what people hear in the United States, that puts the onus on the resistance, not on the Israelis?
Although I'm not a politician, although I'm not, I don't want to speak too much in politics, I'm a doctor, but let me tell you, some people were living in an area in Jerusalem, in the eastern Jerusalem, which is, according to the International Law and Security Council, is a Palestinian territory occupied by the Israelis. Put the word occupied between brackets. So, some people were living in an area called Al-Sheikh Jarrah. Al-Sheikh Jarrah, the families were there, they were asked to flee their house, get outside. We want to replace you by settlers, Israeli settlers. Get lost. This is what was told to people living for thousands of years in that place. Get outside. The people refused. We will not leave our land. How the hell are you kicking me out from my home? So they started to demonstrate. They said no. So some people of solidarity tried to join them, and then it started. And then, you know, the Holy Mosque for us as Muslims is something that we respect. And every Muslim in the world dreams to pray in that mosque. So they decided to go and celebrate a party inside that mosque. What the hell? They are provoking the feelings of 1 billion Muslims all over the world. What the hell do they want from that mosque? What the hell do they want from those families living in peace in Jerusalem? So who have started the problem? If you want to solve this problem, go to the root of the problem. Don't tell me about the reaction when you're putting a cat in the corner and say, why this cat is scratching me? You left no door for this cat to run away. So it will certainly try to scratch, but it is not scratching another animal, another cat. It is scratching a lion. This is a nuclear weapon state, Israel, the strongest state in the Middle East. This is what's being said. And the people here who are resisting them are, you know, using primitive tools to defend themselves. You cannot compare. You cannot say that we have two armies. You cannot say that we have, you know, no, that's not equal. That's unfair to compare. There is no way to compare the F-35 with some homemade missiles in Gaza City, projectiles. And of course, but you know, we do not have good propaganda of media. We are poor. I mean, we are just poor. You know, Dr. Saeb Erekat, I don't know if you heard about him. He was negotiating for many years. Mm-hmm. May God bless his soul. He died a few months ago. He said it many times. He said, please live and let live. If those people live and let us live in our land, that will be fine. But they're not willing to do that. The only dream that they want is to kick us outside from our land. They don't want us to stay even on the historical, now forget about now, we're not talking about historical Palestine, that's something else. On the territories of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, they don't want us even to stay there. They are imposing a siege in Gaza, and they are attacking the West Bank every now and then. You see the settlers on the television, what they do, they are uprooting the farms. Imagine that. Have you ever tried to implant a tree in your life before? If you do that, believe me, you feel that this tree is like one of your sons. Imagine that you have a farm full of olive trees and somebody come to cut all those trees in front of you. Just like this, sabotage. They want to destroy it for you. You have some animals, you're growing them, they come and kill them. They shoot them dead in front of your eyes. And they attack you and they beat you and they insult you. This is happening in the West Bank. It's not happening in the other historical land of Palestine. It's happening in the West Bank, which is supposed to be a Palestinian territory according to the international law and according to the Security Council. What the hell are they doing? They are building thousands of domestic units inside the West Bank, and they are provoking the feelings of the Palestinians. They are giving the Palestinians no chance to live. And then why you are reacting? Please, go back to the root of the problem, and then you will know what are those reactions. They will be I'm not justifying any violence, but for God's sake, they do not want us to live in our land. This is the problem.
Mm-hmm. You know, Dr. Abbas, it's tragic to see so many killed, but when you mention also the 1,000 or so who have been wounded, how many people will be maimed for life? I mean, obviously, those who die will never be brought back, but how many of those who are injured will have to live with these injuries for some time?
Disability, you mean?
Yes.
I don't know. I have not got the figures. Usually you treat them, but I know, I'm quite sure that there are 2 children who have now, one of them is paraplegic and the other one is quadriplegic.
Wow.
He's got, one of them has got a shrapnel in his neck. He lost, of course, he became quadriplegic. His upper and lower limbs are lost. And the other one has got a shrapnel in his lower back, so he's becoming paraplegic. I heard only about 2 of them, but I don't know, I do not have the statistic yet about the rest of the children. And you know, disability, usually you cannot judge from the first days. You have to wait. For those who will recover, they will be okay. For those who will not recover, then they can start to have rehabilitation. And yet we cannot speak, it's early to speak about them now.
Well, Dr. Abbas, before we let you go, I just want to ask one final question. I think many people who are watching this, you were probably the first voice they've heard from the Gaza Strip. What would you like those to know in the United States who are hearing you live to know about the ongoing situation here tonight in Gaza?
Our people here, we love America. We love American people. We hope that one day the United States will support the right of the Palestinians to live in peace on their land. That's it. And to stop killing our children by American weapons, because American weapons are made to help people, not to kill children, I'm quite sure.
Dr. Abbas, we greatly appreciate you joining us here and giving us a little bit of your time and joining us on Breakthrough News.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Well, and that was Dr. Medhat Abbas from the International Department of the Gaza Health Ministry there, Rania, and we really thank him just doubly. There is a lot of challenges, of course, with those in Gaza trying to use the internet, but he stuck with us through multiple different iterations there to join via phone. So Dr. Medhat Abbas, we thank him again. Harrowing, Rania, what we heard there. I mean, Gaza being bombed back to the Stone Age. Hospitals have almost no electricity running off of generators, but because of the blockade, there is limited gasoline, diesel fuel available. They can't bring more in, so it's possible hospitals could lose power. Civilian targets mostly being struck. Children who have been killed, over 39, people who have become paraplegics, and others. Harrowing. And please, 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 I just want to send one final message to Dr. Abbas, who's thanking us for having him on, and we thank him.
Well, no, thank you to him. What he was dealing with sounds just too overwhelming to even think about what that would be like in the position of a medical professional when this level of destruction and violence is taking place against civilian infrastructure. And just to note, Palestinians are not taking this lying down. There's currently reports of a huge rockets on its way to Tel Aviv. And it really is striking to see, you know, these images of the rocket fire that every American official condemns as terrorism. But I will tell you, across the Middle East, that's not how people see it. Across the Middle East, you know, I've heard people in different circles talking, especially older people that I've spoken to have said, you know, from different countries in the region, have said, you know, wow, this is the first time in 73 years Israel's ever been touched like this. Like they're proud. They're proud to see Palestinians fighting back against 73 years of just brutal oppression, apartheid, segregation, being bombed, being displaced, being ethnically cleansed, being massacred. So that's how this is being, the conversation in the Middle East is a very different one than than what's being had in the United States, to say the least.
No, I mean, it really is worlds apart. I mean, we've talked about this so much, Rania. I mean, there is such a conspiracy of silence isn't really the way to just a conspiracy to completely distort the picture of what's going on is maybe the best way to describe it. And I think that, you know, when we look at situations like what's happening now, and even really what we just heard from Dr. Abbas, I mean, you know, even the idea that it's mainly civilians who are being killed is constantly elided in the Western discourse. Mm-hmm. And even to the extent that it's mentioned, it's like, well, they struck this building because they said that there was rockets in the basement or something like that. And I mean, they said, but do you know? And just the way that that's reported, the sort of IDF press release style of reporting, and that's considered fair and balanced in the United States. I mean, if we had, you know, New York Times on, they'd say, well, we're not saying that, we're just saying we're reporting what they said. But when you don't have the ability to independently corroborate whether or not that was a missile site, whether or not that was a military operations room, whether or not it was what they said, when you can't independently corroborate that, and you know civilians are being killed, to then publish something you don't even know to be true, that essentially, I mean, in my eyes, it doesn't justify it, but at least in the eyes of the world, it at least adds a level of justification. I mean, it's journalistic malpractice on every level. That's how I feel when I see some of these pieces.
It's also another element of the asymmetry of this, you know, I hate to use the word conflict, but
I know,
of
it's
this
hard to
Israeli,
describe.
right, of this Israeli aggression, right? The asymmetry of it is that not only does Israel have more powerful weapons, thanks to $3.8 billion a year in American military aid, but it also has a propaganda. I mean, it has people dedicated to international propaganda in different languages, even in Arabic, by the way, if you can believe it. It has, you know, it has the ability to put out its press releases to the international media. Palestinians don't have the ability to reach the international media with their side in the same way that the Israelis do, or to even put out their narrative. They don't have the outlets. They don't have the spokespeople. You know, CNN isn't reaching out to Hamas and Islamic Jihad spokespeople to come on and give the Palestinian military side point of view. You know what I'm saying? So not only do Palestinians have to deal with this, you know, asymmetrical warfare, they also have to deal with this propaganda war that's really, really difficult to break through.
Yeah, no, and it isn't as if they couldn't ask them. I mean, you know, Hamas, the Joint Operations Room, which is the sort of unified element of the factions in the resistance, I mean, they do actually speak to the media all the time around the world. And I think the point that you made, Rania, about the conversation in the Middle East, I mean, you see it in the Iranian media and the Turkish media and other Arab countries' media. You know, they are interviewing and speaking to the people who are representing the resistance while here in the United States, and they know how to reach them. It's just the sort of IDF press release element of it that gets sent out.
So I think this is a great point to pivot to another guest that we're about to bring on. We're about to bring on Rania Masri. I think we're bringing on Rania Masri. She is a political figure in Lebanon. She's a part of the political party Citizens of a State, also a professor at LAU, the Lebanese American University. Rania Masri, welcome.
A pleasure to be with you all, though I wish it were under different circumstances.
It is a pleasure to have you on with us, and I agree. I do wish it was under better circumstances, but I'm really glad we get to have you be a part of this conversation because you're someone who has been very active both in the U.S. and Lebanon on the issue of Palestine. You're even a part of the boycott divestment campaign in Lebanon. And, you know, all of us have watched these wars play out every few years against Gaza. What's your perception this time around? With what's happening? What's your take on what you're witnessing from both the Israeli aggression as well as, you know, at least what I think is a little bit of a different, in a good way, response from Palestinians as well as other Arabs across the region?
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, definitely with regards to the Israeli aggression, the Israeli Zionist state is doing what it knows how to do quite well, which is to murder, to kill, to destroy, to rampage, and to lie consistently about it. Already the level of aggression and destruction in Gaza has made a lot of Palestinians in Gaza say this is worse than the war of 2014 that was imposed against them. We need to remember, that the latest reports that have come out from the UN are saying that more than 10,000 Palestinians in Gaza right now have been rendered homeless. And when we hear these figures, I just would like everyone to remember that Gaza is under siege. So it's not as if, a home was destroyed in Beirut or a home was destroyed in Los Angeles, and then we can, get the material and rebuild through one way or another. We are talking about an open air prison that has been besieged for decades. And so when homes and buildings and markets and hospitals are getting destroyed and bombed, and electricity is being shut down, and the Israelis are threatening to attack the internet cell tower in Gaza so that we get even less news than we're already getting. So when all of this is happening, let us just keep in mind that Gaza is under siege and that reconstruction is going to be extraordinarily limited. Now, in terms of what is new is the uprising that we're seeing coming from 1948 Palestine. And this is immensely inspirational and at the same time very scary. Immensely inspirational because we now have all of the Palestinian people are united, be they in Gaza, in the West Bank, or in 1948 Palestine, and of course in Jerusalem. Whereas previously we know that the Israeli Zionist state had tried to divide the Palestinians through walls and through checkpoints and through guns and through massive disinformation campaigns. Now we're seeing the Palestinians standing together. Where is it scary, though, is that within 1948 Palestine, we have the Israeli military cooperating with the Israeli police, cooperating with Jewish extremist settlers. I mean, calling them extremists, but they're all extremists. They're all working together to mark Palestinian homes in 1948 Palestine. Let us remember, these are Palestinians with Israeli citizenships. Their homes are getting marked. Palestinians are getting arrested from within their homes and languishing in administrative detention. Administrative detention means that now legally, quote unquote, the Israeli state can take these Palestinian citizens and throw them into jail for 6 months without charge and simply renew that detention period. While at the same time, the Israeli Jewish citizens are openly in front of cameras, lynching, killing, beating up Palestinian citizens, throwing Molotov cocktails into Palestinian homes in 1948, and the police are doing nothing. So we need to be all the more vigilant when the Israeli media and some Western media start to say that this is a civil war that we are seeing, as if there is, both sides. This is not a civil war. This is a popular uprising of an indigenous movement, indigenous population demanding its liberation, and of a settler state colony working hand in hand, military, police, and settlers, to oppress, to exploit, to weaken the Palestinians themselves. So in one way, it's inspirational. In another way, it is extremely scary because despite all the information that we're getting from people on the ground in Jaffa and in Haifa and in Ramla and in Lid, we still don't know everything that is happening.
Right. I saw exactly what you were referring to, houses being marked. I saw several interviews with people saying that these Jewish settler militias were marking. They were looking for, Arab homes for Palestinian homes and then marking them with red paint, which is really reminiscent of what happens ahead of ethnic cleansing, ahead of massacres, which is probably what happened in 1948. So, all the more interesting that we're hearing these stories on Nakba Day of all days. But, to move a little bit beyond that, because obviously that is all very scary. What's happening in Gaza is terrifying. But, you mentioned uprisings. And I thought it was so interesting yesterday. And even I got a little bit emotional when I saw these videos of people in Lebanon trying to walk into Palestine. And sadly, one Lebanese man was shot and killed by Israeli forces yesterday in Lebanon, trying to cross into Palestine, trying to break through this colonial border violently imposed on the region. But then there was also thousands of people, both Palestinian and Jordanian, trying to walk into the West Bank yesterday. And that was a really beautiful sight to watch. So, I'm looking across, talking to people in the region. I have to say, I haven't seen people from different countries across the Levant this united around something in a very long time. It's probably going to be brief, but what do you have to say to that? Do you think this is, you know, kind of in a weird way, a uniting moment, a reminder of how important the Palestinian cause is. Because I think for the last few years, at least the enemies of Palestine had convinced themselves that nobody cared about this issue anymore. But I think the last few days have showed us otherwise.
Well, I mean, exactly. It showed to people who thought that the Arab people were like the Arab leaders, that we had forgotten Palestine and that Palestine was démodé and was a subject of the 70s and the 80s. But no, Palestine remains the number one issue in the heart of Arabs around the world. And I would argue it remains the main issue for revolutionaries around the world, because Zionism is not only a threat to the region, Zionism is not only a threat to Palestine, Zionism is not only a threat to Lebanese and Jordanians and Syrians and Iraqis and Egyptians, but Zionism is a threat to the world. And I say that not from an emotional position. I say that because of the intricate relationships that the Zionist state of Israel has supported and built with fascist, dictatorial, racist regimes, be they in Central America, be they in South Africa, be they, you know, in Brazil, in India, so on and so forth. So we need to be looking at this and asking ourselves, what can each one of us do? But to go back to the question that I heard in your question, there is a beautiful uniting moment now. Yes, it is beautiful. It can be very uniting. I hope that we get our courage from the Palestinians in Gaza, from the Palestinians in Lid, from the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, from the Palestinians throughout the land of Palestine. I hope that we get our courage from them. But I also really hope that when the bombing stops, because the bombing always stops, when Palestine is no longer the number one news on our news cycle, that we don't forget Palestine. I also hope that we recognize the sacrifice that these martyrs have given and recognize the need for a political project, because we not only have the brutality of the Zionist state and all its supporters from the UK and Germany and the US, et cetera, but we also have the collaborators in the Palestinian Authority who are still maintaining their security coordination with the Israeli army, which basically security coordination with an enemy is an act of treason. And so we still have the Palestinian Authority holding on to their security coordination. So what we desperately need in Palestine, what we desperately need throughout the Arab region is strong political leadership with a clear political program, so that the brave courage of the Palestinians does not go asunder. This magnificent work by the resistance in Gaza, this magnificent work by Palestinians throughout Palestine who are remaining vigilant and resilient in their homes, must not be left alone and must be built upon with a strong civil political project. This is what we desperately need.
Rania Masri, Professor Rania Masri, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for everything you had to say. I know you were at a protest today.
Yes.
So thank you. Thank you for that as well. Professor Rania Masri, politician from the Lebanese political group Citizens of a State. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rania, and thank you for all this brilliant work. And, you know, may the resistance continue.
And so with that said, yes, may it continue. Eugene.
We do continue. Yeah, no, well, thank you, Rania. Amazing, really, what the other Rania had to say there about what's happening around the region. But we want to also talk, of course, and we've mentioned this several times here today, the issue of the media building. It was a building that housed the offices of Al Jazeera and the Associated Press, along with other media inside of Gaza. This building was attacked earlier, was destroyed and, you know, completely destroyed. It was obviously an attempt to limit the ability of media organizations inside of the Gaza Strip to be able to report what's happening there right now. And of course, 2 guests ago, when we had on Dr. Abbas from the Gaza Health Ministry, we could actually hear in the background, I think it's just after midnight there, we could hear in the background the explosions that were ongoing and that were happening there in Gaza. So they wanted to really silence the voices, or to the extent they could, of reporting what's coming out. So Al Jazeera, Associated Press, their offices, along with other media offices, just flattened. So one of the videos that has come out from the news source Middle East Eye, put this up earlier today, is a video of the phone call between the owner of the building and the Israelis who had called the owner of the building, telling him to evacuate people and so on and so forth. And there's a back and forth around some elements of what's going on there. So we want to bring up this video. I mean, it really is astonishing to see this exchange between these bombers and the owner of this building here that was flattened, as we mentioned. And again, it was the building that held the offices of Al Jazeera, also of the Associated Press.
المسؤول ونقول له احنا يعني 10 دقائق ما حيصير شيء بين الساعه 3 والساعه 3 و10 العماره مش حترجع ثاني خلاص يعني احنا بدنا 4 انفار بس 4 وكلهم لابسين الدروع مش حيروحوا يجيبوا اجهزه قتاليه ولا حيجيبوا كاميراتهم وشغلهم هذول كانوا في بث مباشر يعني تو كلهم هاي شوفهم تو رجعوا كانوا كلهم في المستشفى في مكان وين قتلوا ال10 انفار امبارح في المجزره هذول كلهم هيك الناس الجايه ما في حدا منهم مخرب إذا أعطينا 10 دقائق ساور المسؤول قول له يعني 10 دقائق ما حيصير شيء. يابا تفضل. يدخلوا العمارة ولا واحد صاروا الناس. إحنا محترمين رأيكم يا عمي إحنا ما بنقول لكم بدنا نيجي غصب عنكم. أعطينا 10 دقائق. لا اخوي ليش 10 دقائق القيت احنا صار لنا ساعه نفس الناس بدنا انه الناس يرجعوا للعماره للبرج بتصير خطر من شانهم مش من شاني هذا حياتهم مش حياتي بقول احنا الا نتجادل معك الا 10 دقائق لو في ال10 دقائق سمحت لنا نروح كان راحوا جابوا الاجهزه تاعتهم ورجعوا يعني احنا مش باكين على الجهاز خلاص انت بدك سويه احنا يعني تعب عمرنا كله راح باتنا ذكرياتنا حياتنا ضيعتوها بدك تتكلم لهالوقت على كاميرا ما بدي احكي على كاميرا خلاص ما بدي اللي بدك اياه اسويه انا حسكر واعمل اللي بدك اياه في رب كبير تفضل يا ابا صل على النبي اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد لقيت في ناس بالبرج ولا لا ما في ناس لا ما في ناس لا ما في ناس لا
في عملية مسح ورصد تجري في هذه
And that was, I mean.
So, Eugene.
Yeah, Rania.
I just want to note that when we're talking about Israel bombing, they have a specific doctrine called the Dahiya doctrine, which refers to this area, the suburb of Beirut called Dahi. That's always, in the U.S. press called a Hezbollah stronghold. And yes, it's an area where Hezbollah is very popular. That political party is very dominant. But it refers to the 2006 war in which Israel used overwhelming force against civilian infrastructure to try to get the population to submit. And so that is the doctrine they are implementing here when they do what you just saw, which is where they're just using overwhelming force against civilian infrastructure. That is the doctrine, overwhelming force to force the population to submit. And that's why they're hitting that media building. They're also hitting it because they want to obviously make it more difficult for the international media to show you what's happening in Gaza because it's so horrifying. And it's just amazing because you'll hear the Israelis justify this by saying, oh, Hamas used it for rockets. Hamas is using the people there. That's what they said. You said that Hamas was using the people there as human shields. But you see in that phone exchange, they told people to evacuate the place so they wouldn't kill international journalists. And then the guy's like, okay, it's empty. We're evacuating it. This wasn't a situation. This proves it wasn't a situation where there was any Hamas military involvement whatsoever. It was just Israel destroying media infrastructure. And it should outrage you. Anyone watching that video, especially if you're a journalist, should be absolutely outraged by that exchange.
I mean, it's a direct attack. And I think the point you made very well about they're on the phone, they're warning the person, they say, get out, there's no one in the building, because as you said, they don't want to kill international journalists. But then despite what you said, Rania, which is so true about what it shows, they then went on subsequently to claim that there was some sort of military operations room in there. And I mean, I've seen enough of these wars.
It's weird you would evacuate a military operations room.
That's what they claimed. And I've seen enough of these wars that they always say this. I mean, what is the likelihood that there's going to be a military operations room doing anything of any note in the middle of some high-rise tower that any person with any knowledge knows would immediately be blown up in this kind of situation? It's completely absurd. It's completely absurd. But it goes to the reality of this situation, which I think is we've also talked a lot about and in the past couple live streams streams we've done in the past week, Rania, which is there is a big international outcry that is growing, and even in countries like the United States, which is obviously the uncritical supporter and defender of Israel in all times at the level of the government, thousands and thousands of people on the street today all across the United States, from Bay Ridge, Brooklyn to Raleigh, North Carolina. I've seen photos, and it makes sense. They don't want people to be able to get this information because it is actually having an effect. It isn't just people seeing it and turning away, but more people have been changing their attitude. 150,000 people on the streets in the United Kingdom today. In Paris, France, where President Emmanuel Macron banned demonstrations in favor of Palestine, outright banned them, thousands and thousands of people still took to the streets of Paris, France, and demonstrated in solidarity with Palestine. They were brutally dispersed, by the way, with tear gas and other forms of dispersion by the French police. But France, London, Raleigh, North Carolina, Bay Ridge, Los Angeles, all over the place. We saw 10,000 people last week in Chicago, Illinois. I mean, these images, the reason they need to destroy this building, the reason they need to take it down is exactly that, is that the images and the photos and all of that that come from the media infrastructure are having an effect in terms of what's actually happening in the world. So I'm not surprised, even though I agree it is completely outrageous. We've seen the Associated Press speak out. Let's see about the other Western media.
You know, I have to say I was actually surprised to see the New York Times headline didn't include something like missile experiences, Israeli missile clashes with the international media outlets.
Israel defensively destroys Al Jazeera office.
Yeah, I mean, anybody, you have to have worms in your brain to actually believe that Israel is defending itself. Like, I just don't think anybody who's saying those words believes what they all know it's a bunch of BS. I mean, destroying media infrastructure, destroying power lines, just, threatening to hit cell towers. In Gaza, people are talking about 3 hours of electricity a day because so many of the power lines have been struck. This is an attack on civilians and civilian infrastructure, making sure that Gaza is not only under air, land, and sea blockade, but that it's a miserable place that is 100 years back. It exists in some sort of Stone Age parallel universe. This is punishing a civilian population, killing children. And it's just all these, when I see these American politicians that make these insane statements, I'm just like, you guys can't really believe this. I also want to make a note. This is a little bit comical, but also outrageous. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who I feel like every time we do this show, I have to spend at least 5 minutes hating on him. He hadn't tweeted in days or hadn't said much. He's been, he hasn't said much about this issue. He's spoken to his Israeli counterparts, but at the same time, he hasn't had much to say other than just Israel has the right to defend itself. So he did tweet today something that made me giggle a little bit, if I can find it. He essentially said, as this is going on in Gaza, he made some statement about the atrocities taking place in the Tigray region. And all these people responded and I'm talking about Ethiopia. They're really just, the Biden administration is just pretending this isn't happening. They sent a Hadi Amr to go to Israel to try to help de-escalate the situation. But people I know that, are talking to people in the White House and in the State Department, they're all laughing about this because the Israelis are never going to take that guy seriously. He's half Palestinian. He doesn't really, no one, that's not somebody you send. Not that it's bad he's Palestinian. It's just not somebody you send to go try and get the Israelis to de-escalate. Somebody that the Israelis aren't going to take seriously because they're a bunch of racists anyways.
The Biden
administration is just they're just completely disengaged. So that's why it's so important. The images you're seeing on the screen, these protests around the world are so important because we need our governments to see that people on the ground find what Israel's doing completely unacceptable. And the government's support for it completely unacceptable. And it's gotten to a point where even AOC, had to make a comment. She tweeted an hour ago, apartheid states aren't democracies.
Well, let me say a couple things. One, Ronaldo Martinez, shout out to you for the donation there in the super chat, noted about the Israeli attacks, just like the U.S. military when they brutally invaded Iraq. Thank you for that donation. Just to quickly step back here and remind people to some degree where we are, there are ongoing attacks in Gaza. Dr. Abbas from the Gaza Health Ministry, who we had on earlier, actually just texted me to say that fires have broken out in Gaza from the bombings that are happening there. 145 Palestinians killed in Gaza so far, at least. Of course, that number will continue to grow, at least 145. 41 of those were children, including, I just want to note here, the 2-year-old Yazan Sultan Muhammad al-Masri, I believe, was killed. Oh, no, excuse me, it was about a day ago, killed harvesting wheat in the field. So not today, but killed in that number of 41. This 2-year-old killed with 4 of his family members while they were harvesting wheat in a field. Children, all of them. Unbelievable. 145 overall, over 1,000, just over 1,000. That number will also grow, have been injured in the Gaza Strip, and at least 13 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank. That number could grow as well, but I just want to also note that even though there's this brutal, brutal attack happening in the Gaza Strip that's killed 145, 13 Palestinians killed in the West Bank by Israeli forces. Mass demonstrations happening around the world, 150,000 in London. Looked like tens of thousands to me in Paris, brutally repressed there. That was actually banned, a demonstration that was supposed to be banned. Thousands all around the United States, in Brooklyn, Raleigh, North Carolina, and Los Angeles. I'm just seeing some reports regarding the issue here with the demonstration there, which seems to have grown, but I'm seeing perhaps there looks like maybe 10,000, some are saying there, in Los Angeles. I'll try to check that out. But that is more or less where we are in terms of the current moment. So just wanted to catch those up who might be joining us here on this live broadcast from Breakthrough News. I'm Eugene ElAri alongside Rania with our ongoing coverage of the situation in Palestine.
So on that note, I think it's a great time to bring in our next guest. I'm really excited to welcome to the Freedom Side on Breakthrough News, Ali Abunimah, director of the Electronic Intifada, which is probably, I would say, the best resource when it comes to trying to find out what's actually happening in Palestine. Ali, welcome to the Freedom Side.
Oh, thank you, Rania, and hi, Eugene. I've been on Eugene's show a few times. I think this is the first time we do it visually, so this is fun.
Oh,
absolutely.
That's exciting. And also, it's good to note that I actually had you on Breakthrough News, Ali, I think like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I had you on to talk about these Death to Arabs rallies that were taking place in Jerusalem. And that really is, I think, where we can say the escalation from Israel began to what's escalated to now with this war on Gaza. Can you explain to our guests, I guess as briefly as you can, but just how we got to where we are now? Because of course, Israel's doing all it can to try to change the narrative and the timeline. So how did we end up here with Gaza being bombed, and what does it have to do with Jerusalem?
Well, Israel is bombing Gaza because Palestinians are resisting ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem. That's what it boils down to, is, Israel is a colonial regime. It's an apartheid regime, and it cannot tolerate that the indigenous people or the native people should resist. So what happened is that over the past year, the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, but before that, the Trump administration basically gave everything Israel it wanted. And you had the so-called Abraham Accords, where Israel made these supposed peace deals with various Arab dictatorships, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco. But the big fish in all of this is Saudi Arabia, which, although it didn't officially join the Abraham Accords, is tacitly behind them. None of this would happen without the approval of Saudi Arabia. And the expectation was that Saudi Arabia would sign up next. And the reason they thought that they could get away with this is because they thought the Palestinian cause was dead, and that the Palestinians were so powerless and so isolated that it just didn't matter, that they were no longer a factor. And so Israel took that as a green light to escalate its ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem, in the most brutal and blatant way, to just start literally pushing families out of their homes in the middle of the night and putting Israeli Jewish settlers into them. And, over the past, a week or so ago, Israel carried out several really brutal military attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the most revered sites for Muslims. And this is in the context of growing Jewish extremism in Israel, the so-called settler movement, the so-called temple movement that your colleague Dan Cohen has done good work reporting on. He actually wrote an article for us at the Electronic Intifada a couple of years ago. That it's a great reference because it details all the ways in which the Israeli government and Israeli leaders support this extremist movement that wants to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and replace it with a Jewish temple. And so what Israel didn't expect was that the Palestinian resistance in Gaza would respond to Israel's attacks on Jerusalem and turn this back into a pan-Palestinian and even a pan-Arab resistance movement. We've seen, although they haven't been, massive mobilizations, we have seen mobilizations in Jordan of people going to the border and in Lebanon and even in Syria. But more broadly speaking, I think that it has changed the narrative back to one of really its raw basics, an anti-colonial resistance against a colonial regime that is backed by the West, backed by the United States, very much the way apartheid South Africa was. And the other thing it's done is it's really unified. The struggle has unified Palestinians again. So Israel felt strong as long as Palestinians were divided and fragmented, that you had a few Palestinians caged up in Gaza. The Palestinians in Jerusalem were totally isolated from everyone else. The Palestinians in the West Bank were all broken up into little enclaves. And then, the Palestinians within Israel were, the Palestinian citizens of Israel were, their own little enclave too. And what we've seen is this uprising across historic Palestine. And so you asked me to do this quickly, but that's kind of the big
It can't
picture.
That was quick, actually.
Yeah,
that was quick.
And Israel is basically now, in a sense, in a struggle to repress Palestinian resistance on all fronts. Today, Benny Gantz, the defense minister, who a few days ago threatened to burn Gaza, was actually threatening Palestinians in the West Bank. And he said, basically threatening Palestinians in the West Bank, if you don't stay quiet, then, you'll see what we'll do to you too, basically. And that's because Israel is stretched. Israel is absolutely stretched to the limit, having to fight the resistance in Hamas, having to repress protests in the West Bank, and having to repress protests. And indeed, we're seeing pogroms by Jewish extremists within Israel against Palestinian cities. Last night in Jaffa, Jewish extremist mobs came into Jaffa, firebombed Palestinian homes. There was awful video of a Palestinian boy who was badly burned when these Jewish extremists firebombed his home, and another kid was also injured. So that's what's going on. The whole country is on fire, basically.
Yes. And Israel is stretched thin. They've had to divert the border patrol from the West Bank into 48 Palestine, into Israel proper, where they've had to use them against these protests by Palestinian citizens of the country who are now facing, like you said, pogroms. And we talked about that earlier on the show with David Sheen. And it's quite frightening because, unlike Palestinians in Gaza who do have resistance factions that are able to fight back, Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians inside who have Israeli citizenship and Palestinians in Jerusalem as well, they don't really have a means to fight back. They don't have armed resistance factions. But Ali, we have this thing we do on the lives where if people put money into the super chat, we'll read their comments. And so now it looks like Israel's army of trolls has infiltrated the super chat and seems to be This seems to be Zionists paying for us to read their comments, because there's one person called Game Freak 2 who donated money to the super chat to ask this question. And I think this is a perfect question for you to answer, Ali. He asks, Gaza and Israel are both wrong. Why don't you condemn both sides for the violence? Why are you only blaming Israel? Ali, you eat these kinds of people for breakfast, so why don't you take that question?
Well,
and tell us
I'm
why.
glad. I'm glad that this person asked that question. I'm glad that they threw in a little money to support your show too. That's great. Because the whole narrative of both sides is a false equivalence. It's a narrative that erases the immense power imbalance that exists between. It's an all lives matter narrative, right. Basically, the both sides narrative. It's about erasing power differences. It's about blaming victims. It's about absolving perpetrators. And you can't talk about both sides when you're talking about a nuclear armed state that's receiving $3.8 billion a year from the United States. And that's just from the US. It's also getting vast support from the European Union and the other Western countries and settler colonies who are the main patrons of Israel. And Israel is an occupying power. And so you can't put that in the same category as Palestinians, who are a colonized people. More than half the Palestinian people lives outside Palestine because of wave upon wave of ethnic cleansing. And so that's why we can't talk about both sides. You can't draw a moral equivalence between an occupied people resisting colonization, resisting occupation, fighting for its freedom and its survival on the one hand, and a colonial regime that is conquering and stealing land for settlement and colonization, which is what Israel has been from the start and continues to do today, which is why Palestinians have to resist in Jerusalem. And remember, Gaza, which has 2 million people living in it, more than 70%, or about 70% of the population in Gaza are refugees from lands that are now in Israel. So Gaza is really, in the literal sense, a concentration camp. It's where Palestinians ethnically cleansed from other parts of Palestine were forced to go so Israel could take their land and settle Jews on it. And so that's why it's not both sides. The same way you couldn't talk about apartheid in South Africa as both sides, the same way you couldn't talk about Jim Crow in the United States as both sides. So I think we need to have moral clarity about what is actually going on here.
Thank you for that, Ali. And I just want to also mention Abdul Rahman Mo has also thrown in something in the super chat. And he says, as you were speaking, Ali says, this is true journalism. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Ali, let me ask you this. One thing that I'm certainly curious about, how does this affect the Palestinian political scene in the wake of this? I mean, I think obviously the issue of the elections that were postponed is maybe beside the board, but where does this leave people like Mahmoud Abbas now that this new turn has been taken?
Well, Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank were already basically irrelevant politically. Just a week or so before this major escalation, Abbas had canceled the elections he called for in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, basically because he must have concluded that he was going to lose and that Hamas was going to win again, as it did back in 2006, and was not allowed to, take power in the Palestinian Authority because there was basically a coup against it. That's a story for another day. But and so they were afraid that was what was going to happen again, so they canceled the election. I think if the election were held now, or if there were a ceasefire, Hamas would win, hands down. There's no question about that. And I think that between Gaza and the West Bank, you have, in essence, two models. One model is of collaboration with the occupation, which is what Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority do under the Oslo Accords and under the so-called peace process. They actually go out and help Israel to arrest Palestinians and to control Palestinians. And, you know, the rhetoric and the propaganda of the so-called peace process is if you cooperate, if you engage in dialogue, if you play nice, then you'll get your state one day. You'll get your Palestinian state, and the world will support you. And that, you know, that's the moderate. If you're moderate, we'll treat you nice. But the reality is that Palestinians in the West Bank are under intensified attack by Israel. Israeli theft of Palestinian land throughout the West Bank, including and especially Jerusalem, has been accelerating. And essentially, the Palestinian Authority has helped Israel to crush any resistance. So the existence of the Palestinian Authority, far from bringing Palestinians closer to self-determination, actually helps Israel to occupy and colonize Palestinians even more deeply. And then you have the model, so to speak, of Gaza, which is the model of resistance, where, you know, the standard kind of mainstream talking point is, oh, well, you know, Palestinians in Gaza are suffering because of Hamas and because they fire rockets. But the point is that, you know, Israel is not willing to give Palestinians anything, whether they collaborate like Mahmoud Abbas does or whether they resist. But resistance is what actually produces some kind of balance where Israel has to take you seriously. Now, Hamas can't inflict on Israel a fraction of the damage that Israel does to Palestinians day after day, year after year. But it has produced something of a balance where it can impose a price on Israel. Right now, you know, millions of Israelis are hiding in their homes. The streets are empty. The airport is shut down. So Israel is basically being isolated from the world the way, you know, obviously not as severely by any stretch. But, you know, as the Hamas leader, Ismail Haniyeh, said earlier this evening, he said, you know, Israel has besieged Gaza for 15 years, and now Gaza is in a way besieging Israel. So, you know, creating a kind of a balance. And history tells us that, you know, if you take South Africa, the only reason the white supremacist government eventually agreed to negotiate to end apartheid was because the cost of maintaining the system became too high.
Right.
For decades, the apartheid regime looked for leaders like Mahmoud Abbas who would collaborate, who would reduce the costs of apartheid, who would govern and rule black people on behalf of the white supremacist regime. And they failed to do that. So, but it was the growing international isolation and the growing internal resistance that finally made the white supremacist government agree to end apartheid. And so that's the logic of resistance, and the logic also of international solidarity and boycott that says you have to make Israel pay a price for oppressing Palestinians before it's going to seriously consider abiding by international law or respecting their rights. So in that sense, you know, to come back to your question, Mahmoud Abbas has become irrelevant. I think the Arab leaders who celebrated their marriage with Israel over what they thought was the dead body of the Palestinian cause have been, you know, completely just, you know, they have, to put it politely, egg on their faces, and they're all staying very, very quiet now. We're not seeing them wanting to rush to Tel Aviv for more, you know, signing ceremonies and shindigs and so on. And I think that you see the support internationally is unprecedented. The popular support that I'm seeing, the mainstreaming of the idea that resistance and self-defense is legitimate for an occupied people, and that an occupier, an aggressor, doesn't have a right to self-defense. To put it in simple terms, if someone invades your home and tries to kill you and you kill them, that's self-defense. But if they kill you, that's murder. So Israel doesn't have a right to defend its settler colonies and its land theft and its ghettoization of Palestinians. That's an aggression. That's an attack. So Palestinians have a right to defend themselves against that attack. And I think we're seeing more and more people in the world understand that basic logic. And that, I think, is important because ultimately, you know, to get to justice, to get to the how, you know, the what and the how and the who. Sorry, I'm doing my AOC impression there now.
So I'm like holding, and that was funny. I can't. Sorry, we're in a dark moment, but that was funny.
It's very late where I am. It's 1:30 a.m. I think it's the same time for you. But
speaking, Ali, real quick of you. No, you're making such an excellent point, and I think you're right about the mainstreaming of some of these ideas. And so speaking of AOC, I mean, she did tweet that, you know, apartheid states. What was it? She said, apartheid states aren't democratic. She's obviously talking about Israel. And I think it's funny, people were responding to her, okay, if you believe that, then support BDS. But the word apartheid is making its way into popular culture with respect to Israel. You have the Human Rights Report coming out calling Israel an apartheid state. But Salem has called Israel an apartheid state. And so there was this clip that on MSNBC that went viral of MSNBC anchor Ali Velshi, I guess I'm not sure if he was defending not Israel, like not calling Israel an apartheid state, but I want to watch this clip and get your reaction, Ali. Do we have the clip?
Okay, I haven't seen this. I never.
Yeah, I actually haven't seen it either, but it's been making its way around Twitter, and so I actually think we should all react to it. It'll be interesting. Yes. We'll get some raw reactions here.
Okay.
Palestinians are, at best, third-class citizens in the nation of their birth. The idea that it's even remotely controversial to call what Israel has imposed on Palestinians a form of apartheid is laughable. One look at a current map of Israel, Gaza, and the occupied territories conjures up only one other example: apartheid-era South Africa. The Israeli government, on an ongoing basis, declares parcels of land on which Palestinians live to be either of military or archaeological importance, causing residents to be evicted. Sometimes there's a court case, and almost always the Palestinians lose. Yet months or weeks later, that same important land suddenly becomes home to a brand new Israeli settlement. As more and more Jewish settlers take over land on which Arabs live, the occupied West Bank becomes de facto more Israeli and, in the explicit hopes of the Israeli government, more Jewish. This is a long-standing attempt and a deliberate attempt to force Arabs who have lived in that land, sometimes for hundreds of years, out. It's an attempt to dilute their presence, because to have Arabs as full participants is, in the opinion of the Israeli government and their courts, diluting Israel.
That actually, that's incredible to have that on MSNBC. Ali, what do you make of that?
Yeah, you know, wow, that did surprise me. But my immediate reaction when I was listening to that was, oh, okay, well, yeah, that's all true. But that was true 20 years ago. It was true 30 years ago. It was true 50 years ago. It was true 73 years ago when Israel was established. And so I also feel kind of angry that it's taken this long to get to this point where people now feel they can start to talk about this. Why weren't we believed when we explained this 20, 30, 50, 70 years ago? Why weren't we believed? That makes me angry, because you have to think about how many lives have been destroyed by this situation, how much human potential has been lost. You know, I often think about, you know, the one time I went to Gaza in 2013, it's the only time I was able to get in. And, you know, people talked about the effects of the siege, the economic effects, the, you know, the humanitarian effects. But the one thing that stuck with me is talking to young people in Gaza. And remember that 51% of the population in Gaza is 18 or under.
Wow.
Who were so, like, engaged in the world, you know. And if you're on social media and you follow people in Gaza, you'll know how engaged people are in Gaza. I think there's way more people from Gaza on Twitter and on social media than from the West Bank. You know, there's just something about Gaza, about being under siege, that makes people seek engagement. And so I met so many young people with so much ambition and so much hope, and they were university students. So there's a very high level of education in Gaza, and you know, the prospect they faced of coming out of university and having zero life prospects in Gaza, you know, which has the highest unemployment rate in the world. The only possibility of having some kind of future where they could live that potential was to leave, to emigrate, to become a refugee, to get on a boat and risk drowning in the Mediterranean. And you have to multiply that by 70 years. You know, how many millions of people, while Israelis fulfilled their potential, you know, basically lived the stolen lives of Palestinians on their land. How much human potential was lost? So that makes me angry that we've had to wait this long just to be believed. But okay, it's happening. I think, and I say this, I'm like a broken record, don't take yes for an answer. So, okay, AOC is saying apartheid. That's good, fine. But I'm not satisfied. I'm in a hurry. We need action. So, okay, AOC, what do we do with an apartheid state? We boycott, we divest, we sanction. Why aren't you saying that? You know? Why are the progressives, why are the squad talking about conditioning aid to Israel? Why you don't condition aid to an apartheid state, you cut aid to an apartheid state. They should be saying that. It shouldn't be that hard. They should be saying clearly, if they're as appalled as everyone else is, and as you should be about the massacres in Gaza, about the settlements that they condemn, about the apartheid, they should be demanding that the Biden administration support, instead of oppose, the International Criminal Court investigation that could bring people like Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz and so many others to justice, but give Palestinians their day in court.
Yeah.
These things would be no-brainers in any other context. So we have to keep pushing, because look how long we've had to wait. And I still get people telling me, be patient, be patient. Right. How patient do we have to be? How many more dead Palestinians, how many more Palestinians have to die before people in Washington are comfortable saying we shouldn't be funding this at all? We shouldn't,
Ali,
we shouldn't be doing business with this at all.
Why do you think, like, what is the obstacle here? Like, these people, so when we talk about electing progressive Democrats to office, the idea is that they're not going to be beholden to the same interests as the corporate Democrats. So someone like AOC isn't dependent on AIPAC. Someone like Ilhan Omar certainly is not dependent on AIPAC, though she at least supports BDS. But what is it? What's blocking these politicians? Why is it such a hard thing in your opinion? I know we can only speculate, but why? Why are they only talking about conditioning aid to Israel rather than somebody going off and just saying, let's end aid to Israel? Why are we even funding their military? Why isn't that conversation even being had?
You know, it beats me, honestly. I mean, it's like, you know, is it political ambition? Is it this, you know, what people say that you don't change the Democratic Party changes you? That's a whole discussion. I certainly think that, you know, we've had enough evidence at this point that the Democratic Party is not going to be a vehicle for change. You know, Bernie Sanders wrote an op-ed in the New York Times today saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. You know, in the context that it's bombing children in their beds in Gaza. You know, it's to me, that's just unfathomable. And Bernie Sanders still won't support BDS. He still won't support a boycott of Israel. In fact, he's spoken out against it. And he is the most progressive politician we can get. I just think, you know, people should be mad about that. I can't take this attitude of, oh, well, it's the best we can get and we just have to keep, you know, making incremental change. It's the same, you know, for me, it's the same with all the other issues like that, you know, if we're talking about the United States, which I don't really want to do because I'm thousands of miles from it. And when you're thousands of miles from it, you realize how like, self-centered America,
Yes.
you know, Americans
Right.
and American
It really, yeah.
discourse is. You know, once you get out of the US, you realize that it's like. But I mean, we are talking about the American context, and it's like healthcare. It's like, how long are we? You promised to go to Washington and create a ruckus and force this issue, and then you didn't do it. You know, you didn't fight for a $15 minimum wage. I think it's the same problem. Why didn't they do that? Why wouldn't they do that? Why wouldn't they take on the establishment and actually rally people to their cause? I don't know. It's a different kind of politics. It's accommodationist. It's defeatist. It's appeasement. I don't know.
Well, I guess all we can do is speculate about that. But
it's liberal. It's liberal.
It's liberal.
It's, you know,
it's liberalism. It's liberalism. Ali, I know, you know, it's late for you and you don't have too much longer to stay on. So I really want to make sure we get to this. Yes. You recently had an interview that you did for Deutsche Welle, which is the German-backed news outlet. And I loved this interview. We actually showed it. I think we showed the clip on the show a couple days ago, where you ultimately, and I'll paraphrase, but you basically you said in so many words that why is the German government why are they forcing Palestinians to pay for the Nazi Holocaust of Jews, right? Because the German government supports Israel unconditionally as part of like reparations for the Holocaust. And it was such a powerful statement you made. And it went pretty viral. And then within a couple days, or maybe in 24 hours, Deutsche Welle took down the interview, saying that they apologized for having on an anti-Semite who was supporting terrorism. So what was your reaction to that censorship? And what do you think happened there?
Yeah, I mean, this was a live interview last Tuesday, and I just told them that, you know, since this is German state media, I think people in Germany need to know that Palestinians are sick of paying the price for Germany's genocide of European Jews. And, you know, there is this belief in Germany among the elites, it's kind of universal across the political spectrum in Germany, that somehow unconditional support for Israel's racist apartheid state of occupation and land theft and massacres somehow atones for Germany's crimes. And it's based on this completely false equation between Zionism and Judaism. It's actually, German support for Israel is actually anti-Semitic because it equates Zionism and the Israeli state with Judaism. And so I said all this. Then I learned from Twitter, actually, I saw people tweeting that Deutsche Welle issued a public apology for this interview. And they smeared me. They actually issued a statement to the German news agency DPA, smearing me as anti-Semitic and a supporter of terrorism. And it made the interview go absolutely viral. It went completely viral in Jordan. It's gone viral in Turkey. I've gotten messages from all over the world, from Pakistan, from...
I actually got it. I got it on WhatsApp. I got it on WhatsApp from like various WhatsApp groups I'm in with cousins and friends in Lebanon.
It's been incredible. Yeah. I mean, I've never seen, nothing I've done has ever gone viral like that. It's really been amazing, which I think points to the that people want to be able to talk about these things. They want them to be said, and the repression that, you know, that they immediately smeared me as an anti-Semite for acknowledging the German genocide of European Jews. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. You know, you'd think from what they said about me that I denied the Holocaust. I actually went on there and affirmed the Holocaust and said that Germany should pay the price for the Holocaust and not Palestinian children in Gaza, who are paying the price because Israel is armed by Germany. And it's been armed by Germany for decades. They did smear me. They did call me an anti-Semite. I'm now investigating to see whether there are any options to challenge that in Germany, because I think it's defamation and libel, and as a matter of principle, they shouldn't be able to do that. But it tells you where the state of the discourse is in Europe, where in France, in Paris, I don't know if you saw the images today of police. Emmanuel Macron sent thousands of riot police with water cannons and batons to repress Palestine solidarity rallies in Paris. And this is in the country that, you know, claims to be the champion of free speech. It's so ludicrous. It's so ridiculous. You know, you can't parody it. They're actually like beating people in the streets. They arrested the 71-year-old head of the Association France Palestine Solidarité, a man called Bertrand Heilbronn. They arrested him the other day because that group had planned a rally on Wednesday that the French government also banned. So that's really, I mean, it also shows you that Israel's case is so weak that it cannot withstand a public debate. It cannot withstand public scrutiny. And so the so-called democracies have to engage in this intense, brutal repression that they would condemn if it were in, you know, one of their official enemy countries. But they use it against their own citizens to protect Israel.
Yeah, I mean, it really is notable to see, you know, the Macron and these others who have been crowing about freedom. Also want to just note on that same note about so-called democracies, in Kashmir, 21 people arrested just for organizing a demonstration, or planning on organizing a peaceful demonstration. And of course, the police in Kashmir are not claiming that they were going to, well, they are trying to claim that they were terrorists, but nevertheless, they aren't claiming that they were going to do anything other than have a demonstration, but they said doing a demonstration in solidarity with Palestine in Kashmir was actually a vehicle for terrorism. But it does give you a sense, adding India, I think, into those same countries and the same governments. And of course, India, the BJP movement, there's been this huge online movement of Modi supporters supporting Israel on Twitter and on social media. And it really is, I mean, the support for Israel, Ali, I think is so notable because the people who support it really are the most execrable people in the world. Like when I look at the two sides of who's supporting which side in this, it to me says quite a bit.
Yeah, it really does. And in the US, it is always the most right-wing, the most extreme, the most fascist, the most white supremacist elements of US society, and of course the Democratic Party. But I don't think I said anything contradictory there, really.
No. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry, Rania, you were saying something? Oh, Rania, you're muted. I don't know why. Well,
there
Rania,
I go. I
say.
constantly
Okay,
do this. I'm like technologically illiterate sometimes. I
We're
just wanted
helping
to,
you.
actually, I was just trying to remind our audience, not that they really need an introduction because you are who you are, Ali, but we are speaking to Ali Abu Nima, the director of the Electronic Intifada. Again, one of the best resources on the issue of what's happening in Palestine. And not just Palestine, actually, on Israel's attempts to suppress free speech in the US with its attacks on the BDS movement. And so on. I mean, Ali, you know, I guess before we let you go, I want to get your take on something I think is very scary that's happening. Because I mean, we talked about a lot of interesting, positive kind of aspects of this is uniting the Arab region. I loved yesterday when I saw people on the Lebanese border trying to get into Palestine, on the Jordanian border, trying to get into Palestine, showing their solidarity. But at the same time, you have this Israeli government that's lurched so far to the fanatical right, to a degree where they're openly saying, you know, openly inciting this eliminationist rhetoric about Palestinians, and it's starting to hurt Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, who have really no protection at all. You have these these gangs of Jewish militias, Jewish settler militias roaming around these towns. They've been said to have been putting red paint on the homes of that they can identify as Arab, which is reminiscent of the kinds of things you might have seen in like Bosnia, or kind of thing ISIS did actually, right? Was marking the homes of minorities, of Christians and of Shias. This is really dangerous. They have the protection of the Israeli police. You mentioned they firebombed a home in Jaffa yesterday, and there's a 12-year-old Palestinian child in critical condition as a result. There seems to be an explosion of violence against Palestinians who are citizens of Israel at the moment. Where is this going to? Where do you see this leading? Because I don't see anybody trying to put a lid on it. I see the opposite happening. Netanyahu's inciting. The public affairs minister, Amir Ohana, is inciting, calling these Jewish militias a force multiplier. They're trying to make it sound as if it's Jews who are being attacked. So where do you see this going?
Yeah, they're working hand in hand with the state. There have been, Telegram groups that have been revealed where there's a lot of coordination going on. The videos are showing how they're actually just attacking people in their homes. It's unreal. People have been saying it's like something from the 1930s in Europe. And I don't think that's an exaggeration by any stretch. And it's part of this kind of frustration, because Zionism is built on this idea of supremacy, that Israeli Jews are the rulers of the land, and the Palestinians need to know their place. And when the Palestinians fight back, it just produces this intense anger that has to be taken out in this horrific violence that has really erupted in recent days. And Netanyahu gave a speech this evening where he talked about murderous Arab gangs on the one hand, which is basically Palestinians in Israel mostly defending themselves. There have been some incidents that you could call, unjustifiable, but they've been pretty rare. It's mostly what we've seen. What we've seen is these Jewish extremists attacking Palestinians. But he didn't talk about murderous Jewish gangs. He talked about Jews taking the law into their own hands. In other words, he was basically saying that, yeah, Palestinians deserve to be attacked and lynched, but we, the state, should do it. Not you as individual Jews. We, the state, should do it. So he was really identifying with the lynch mobs, but saying, we'll do the lynching through the law. You don't do it as freelancers, which of course is disingenuous, because we've seen Israeli officials. There was a video of a deputy mayor saying, we've got hundreds of settlers coming in from the West Bank, and they're going to be helping us. They're going to be going into the Arab neighborhoods. So it is all coordinated with the state. Just before, I do have to get off the line in a moment, but before we go, I just wanted to draw attention that right now, as we speak, there is intense bombardment of Gaza. And, I keep glancing down because I'm looking at my phone and looking at the feeds from some of the people I follow in Gaza. And one of those people is Ref ElAri, a wonderful writer, a wonderful literature professor. He teaches Shakespeare and other literature to his students in Gaza. He's always quoting Shakespeare on Twitter. That's why that came to mind. But what he's talking about right now is pretty horrifying. I just want to read a couple of the things he's saying.
Yes,
and this was just within the last, within the last hour. He said, "Oh, you have?
Go ahead,
That's
Ali.
wonderful."
We had him on, but I just wanted to say who you're about to read. He is. You'll see from Ali how prolific he is, how wonderful he is at writing. But we had him on earlier, but the connection was so terrible. Because we couldn't. Israel's blocked his ability to even be interviewed. because they are hitting so much infrastructure. We could barely hear him. But go ahead, Ali, for what Ref ElAri said.
This is within the last hour since the volleys of rockets were launched at Tel Aviv. And he says, over 15 explosions in Gaza City right now. Horror, 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 as the little kids weep in sheer terror after over 20 Israeli raids. More bombs, more blasts. Israel is destroying every inch of Gaza. Palestinians all over the besieged Gaza Strip talking about an unidentified obnoxious odor, more like sewage, that fills the air soon after every Israeli air raid. We are not sure about its nature or whether it is poisonous. There are reports and anecdotal evidence of Palestinians suffocating under the rubble. Israel is sending Gaza 100 years back by destroying all infrastructure, no roads, no running water, no sewage, no schools, no homes. And that's what Rifat is writing right now. And that's been the reality for so long. And that's why I think all of us who care about this need to put maximum pressure. We can't leave Rifat and we can't leave all the people in Gaza and across Palestine alone to be pummeled by bombs and missiles provided by the United States forever.
Well, Ali, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your time, coming to us from Amman, Jordan. Ali Abunimah, director of the Electronic Intifada. Follow the Electronic Intifada. Follow Ali on Twitter. His work is incredible. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rania. Thank you, Eugene. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, anytime.
And with that,
Rania, yeah. Well, sorry, you were going to say with that. I don't know if you were going to.
No,
say
I
something.
mean, just what he was reading from Rifat. If people who are watching want to go back, they can hear Rifat speaking to us from Gaza. But the connection was just so terrible, we couldn't have him on as long as we wanted to, because it was difficult to hear him. But just think about all the people in Gaza whose voices, because of this Israeli bombardment, they can't even come on an a basic interview show and just tell us what's happening that easily, because Israel's bombing telecommunications infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's bombing power lines, and it's making it, today it bombed that media building, making it increasingly difficult for us to actually know what these bombs are doing to people on the ground.
Yes. Yes. Well, you know, we still are looking for, they're giving you these updates and they're coming in slowly, but we know that at least 145 Palestinians have been killed in these aerial and naval and ground assaults, artillery assaults on the Gaza Strip. At least 145 have been killed, 41 children. Source in the Gaza Ministry of Health told us just over 1,000 have been wounded. 13 Palestinians have been killed in this conflict in the West Bank as well. And of course, as you mentioned, Rania, there's ongoing pogromist-style activity inside of 48 Palestine. And when we had Dr. Abbas on from the Gaza Ministry of Health, we could hear, this is about an hour ago, we could hear the bombs behind him at times landing in different explosions. He told us he hadn't slept for the past 5 days. And I've been seeing this all over Twitter, where people have been in Gaza saying they can't sleep for days and days and days because of this activity. There's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide. There's tens of thousands of people trying to hide in UN schools, mainly people trying to take their kids there and families to protect them. Just Faustian bargains all around. I saw something interesting earlier, Rania, of someone in Gaza saying that there's two choices people make, whether or not, in the night when they know it's going to get much more intense, whether or not to put everyone in the house in one room so that they all die at one time. If the place is struck, they all die together, or whether to try to spread people out so that if the place is hit, that someone potentially could survive. And I think that's an unbelievable state of affairs. I mean,
and that's how it was in 2014. I remember people had those same conversations in 2014. Just the fact that the world sits by idly watching, not idly actually, arming Israel to do this, arming Israel to terrorize children, to terrorize families, and to kill them. I mean, they're just they're shooting at fish in a barrel. These people are defenseless. They don't have bomb shelters, and they're at the mercy of Israel and of how much luck they have.
Yes.
I mean, Israel, it just seems like Israel's picking, it's like got a map and it's just pointing and deciding, okay, that's where we're going to drop a Hellfire missile.
Right.
I mean, I just like it. I don't know. There's no logic other than the logic of intentionally killing civilians, intentionally destroying civilian
I think that's 100% true. And I'll just note here, just to give some of the different elements, because you know the way it's reported in the West, you'd think that Hamas had killed 140 Israelis. 10 Israelis have been killed, 2 people today, 145 Palestinians. 145 Palestinians versus 10. But to speak to your point, Rania, even more deeply, and I read this earlier and I want to read it again, when you talk about the deliberate targeting of civilians, Mohammed Ibrahim Suleiman, 15 years old, killed with his father while they were working in their fields. So this isn't some collateral damage somehow in Gaza City, and not that that's right. I mean, this is 2 people who were just out in their fields working, but I'm not surprised. They were shot by a drone missile, and it reminds me when I thought of this about what we've learned from many different people, including, many different journalists about U.S. rules of engagement as it concerns drones in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this was one of the most controversial things, is that they weren't even really checking whether people were quote-unquote civilians or quote-unquote fighters. They just had this thing, if you were a male between 15 and 60, I believe, and they were gathering in groups of 3 or more, they would just shoot at you and just assume, well, you must be a fighter. So I'm not surprised that this 15-year-old boy and his father were killed while harvesting their crops in Gaza.
Actually, the U.S. targeted killing program was modeled in many ways after the Israeli targeted killing program and the drone program as well. The drone program, the Obama administration had tried to justify these targeted killings. And in the Justice Department legal rationale, they actually cited Israeli presidents.
Yeah. They also cited
which I wrote
Nixon's
about.
invasion of Cambodia, so it gives you a sense of the moral
There you
clarity
go, who
of
we're
the
looking
Obama
to or how we're looking to. But the point is all of this is like this is, you know, this comes all out of the War on Terror manual. That tries to justify these killings.
A 2-year-old killed with 4 of his other family members while harvesting wheat. A 2-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, that's what this war is. This is a war. We are not being hyperbolic when we say this is a war on families and a war on children. 40% of the casualties, according to the Gaza Health Ministry so far, are women and children. And that's not to suggest that all the men on the other end who've been killed are all fighters even. That's just noting because, you know, when it's women and children, it's obviously civilians. So the civilian toll is likely more than half. And again, you know, just look to past. In 2014, you know, I keep citing this statistic, but it can't be said enough. The Israelis in 2014, Operation Protective Edge, 51-day war on Gaza, killed over 2,200 Palestinians. Over 500 of them were children, and 80% of them were civilians. That was also a war on civilians. This is a war on civilians. It's not, you know, a war. It's a war between, you know, when they say Hamas fired 100 rockets and Israel responded with 10 missiles, one rocket does like a 100th of the damage as an Israeli missile can do. Yeah. And I don't even know if I'm just guessing. I don't even know if my math actually adds up there. It might even be that an Israeli missile does 1,000 times more damage than every homemade rocket fired by Hamas. This is not an equal fight.
You know, it's not. One thing I just saw here that I also want to read, this is actually from the West Bank, and I think it's notable because there have been protests across the West Bank of Palestinians in solidarity with Gaza. One of the 13 I mentioned who were killed, a young person, I don't have his exact age here, Waji Jafara, was shot by the Israeli police, and then they allowed him to bleed to death. They directed heavy fire at his car, shot him, and then when the medical team showed up to try to save his life, they just let him bleed out. So the level of atrocities from Gaza to what I just said, to what you have outlined earlier in the show, Rania, regarding and Ali as well, the firebombing of the home inside of 48 Palestine that had injured 2 young people from a Molotov cocktail, and, you know, the rampaging mobs. And by the way, the Palestinian news agency, WAFA, the Palestinian news agency, reporting more of that is happening. More is coming out on that internal communications of groups continuing to plan these aggressive, provocative, violent actions. You know, I saw somebody on ABC, a guy from Palestine, his name is now eluding me, but I mean, the interview itself was unbelievable. The questions they're asking on ABC, I mean, shameful. But nevertheless, he was noting that when many of these settler groups had come to his area of where he was living that they were carrying Uzis and that the police were protecting them. And I mean, you gotta be kidding me. Are they just running around with Uzis? I mean, what is this? I mean, it's just so, I mean, it's one of those things where, like, if you pay attention, obviously, like, you and I are not surprised that settlers are armed. They're always armed. They're always walking around with these M16s. Where do those come from? Interesting. But, you know, you look at this, and I think most people just have no idea that these armed thugs are moving in the hundreds, not just in the past few weeks. And that's the sad thing, is that what was picked up there a few weeks ago, as it were, inside of East Jerusalem with that rampaging mob chanting death to Arabs, going towards the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that really sort of kicked all this off, is that this has been a mainstreaming that's been happening of these forces for years, and now it's just breaking into the international consciousness. And I really just hope that people remember that this is not random, it's not out of the blue, but it really is. And here we are on Nakba Day, 73 years after, I think it was, what, 750,000, 850,000 Palestinians who were expelled from their homes, that this is, in the words of Malcolm X, the chickens coming home to roost. For those who have not seen these types of images before, all of this is the culmination of this apartheid-style establishment of Israel, the way it's maintained itself since the land grabs, the ethnic cleansing, and all of it, Rania.
It's the logical conclusion of Zionism. This is not a surprise. This is required. It's a requirement of Zionism, of Jewish nationalism, of maintaining a Jewish majority in a part of the world that isn't majority Jewish. You have to carry out extreme levels of violence. This is what settler colonialism looks like. And I think it's really important to emphasize the point that Ali Abunimah was making, which is to say that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself from the people it's occupying. There is no right at all. Yeah. Israel is the aggressor. It's Palestinians who have that right. And they are defending themselves.
They are.
And not only are they defending themselves, I mean, I think this is the strongest resistance to Israel's aggression that people have seen ever.
Yeah.
Ever. And I really mean that. I mean, I'm telling you, like my elderly father today, he said to me, 73 years, we never saw people in Tel Aviv running like this. Like, it's a surprise. It's a surprise to a lot of Arabs who were born in the 40s. My dad was born in the 40s. You know, he was born in a time when he remembers his father in Lebanon taking a train from Beirut to Jaffa to get oranges.
Right.
And it was like nothing. I mean, these places, they're not big, right? It's like states. It's like Maryland, Virginia.
Sure.
You know, it's like these places used to be easily like there was fluid and travel, and families lived in different parts, and it was the British and the French that came and tore it all up and drew these borders, and then imposed a Jewish state, a sectarian state, the first sectarian state, onto the region in a very violent European colonial style. And that continues until this day. And what we're seeing now is a result of that, is a result of colonialism, of imperialist powers doing this to the Middle East. And it's the region, and it's had consequences on the region beyond just Palestine. It's reverberated across the region and completely shattered and reshaped it in a way that in many ways isn't reversible. But, you know, you have to really look in awe at the people, Palestinian people, Lebanese people, Syrian people, all those who've been impacted by Israel's aggression and settler colonialism, how they've managed to, generations later, still understand some level of their history and still have some level of solidarity with one another against Israel, and still, you know, protest in support of Palestinians, understanding them to be the indigenous people of this land, and refusing to submit.
Yes. Well, Rania, I think we're going to leave it there for this stream. Obviously, this will be ongoing in Palestine on through the next, well, we'll see how long. But as we leave it here, 145 Palestinians, including 41 children, killed so far in Gaza. Just over 1,000 people injured in this assault on Gaza, 13 Palestinians killed in the West Bank during this broader conflagration. The UN Security Council will meet tomorrow, Sunday, and address this issue. We don't know exactly what will happen there, but we do know that the Irish foreign minister has said that the country of Ireland will be speaking out against the killing of children by the Israeli government. So that at least should be interesting to watch. And there are fresh calls for more protest in the West Bank to coincide with the Security Council meeting tomorrow. So that will certainly be something to watch for. But thanks everyone for watching us here, of course, on this stream. If you're watching on YouTube, or if you're not watching on YouTube, go to youtube.com/breakthroughnews. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you hit the bell so you can get these alerts. We will be continuing to bring you ongoing coverage, ongoing updates in the coming days as it concerns the broader situation in Palestine. So we thank everyone for watching us here on this emergency live stream, I think we can call it, in the midst of this terrible, terrible crisis in Palestine. But for Breakthrough News, I'm Eugene ElAri with Rania. We will see you next time.